Wednesday.
You know what we do on Wednesdays? We listen to Supreme Court hearings. That's right. There's a major oral argument for a Supreme Court hearing happening right now, actually.
Oral arguments. No, it's over. It looks like it already happened, but
Well, it just happened and we're going to listen to it. So in Tennessee, they passed a law regarding health care for minors that want to transition.
right.
Okay.
Yeah. They said, cut it off. Oh, I mean,
Well,
cut
wait a
off the
minute.
health care.
Yeah. Let's be very specific on what they said. All right. That's not what they said. So actually, let me read pretty quickly part of the law here. So this law, this is from Tennessee. This was passed last year. It says a healthcare provider shall not knowingly perform or offer to perform on a minor or administer or offer to administer to a minor a medical procedure if the performance or administration of the procedure is the purpose of enabling a minor to identify with or live as a purported identity inconsistent with the minor's sex.
Their biological sex. Look at that. Holy
Right.
cow.
So that's an incredibly broad, just yeah, you cannot do any sort of medical procedure that has anything to do with transitioning whatsoever.
So the argument made it sound like the argument that the lawyers are saying that this law is against the Constitution. They're saying that it it discriminates based on sex,
Yes.
which I don't. How does that? I mean, what you just read doesn't seem to discriminate based on sex.
Okay. So here's the argument. The argument, and this, I've talked about this before. This came up in the uh the case that was about whether you could discriminate against someone who is transgender in terms of working a job. So there
Mm-hmm.
was a case, I forget what it was called, where there was a trans person who did not pass very well. It was a big
Oh
fat
shit.
dude who was transitioning to a woman, and they worked at a funeral home. And
Oh,
I
I
believe
remember
they,
that.
yes, and I believe they worked and like at the I forget the exact job title, but the person that like interacts with the customers and
The
clients and people that are mourning,
the bereaved
and
family members.
the grieving family members, and they're like, well, it's like pretty distracting when you have a non-passing trans person who's like a big fat guy who's transitioning to like a big fat non-passing trans woman. To people don't want to deal with that like at a funeral, right? They just
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
want to, yeah. And so I believe they offered
Understandable.
them a job that wasn't
Oh, visible. Yeah.
visible and they turned it down. And so they fired them. I believe I could be in that wrong. And they fired them. And so they sued. And so the argument essentially, the sex discrimination argument, which is going to come up here, is that so this law is saying that you cannot offer someone a medical procedure that does not that has to do with them trying to identify with a different sex, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, this would say if you're a boy, you can't give a boy breast implants.
If you're a male,
If you're born male, you cannot give someone breast implants, or I'm sorry, you can't give a minor breast implants in Tennessee.
right?
But
So the discrimination is that that would only be available to males,
well, to women.
right?
So for example, so if you were a female and you had, I don't know, you said breast cancer or some accident when you were minor and you lost your breasts and you wanted to get breast implants or just maybe you just want to do it
You
cosmetically and you're
could get
minor,
them. Yeah, I
you
get it.
could get them. Right. And so they're saying, well, you're saying that you're going to allow women to do this procedure, but you're not going to let men do this procedure. That's sex discrimination. So that's the argument.
Okay. So shall we jump in?
Okay, well, hold on. Let me read. So this case is United States versus Skirmetti. That's the name of it. So let me read just shortly the history of it. Okay, so on March 22nd, 2023, the Tennessee House passed this bill that the whole bill essentially says it prohibits certain forms of gender affirming care for transgender minors with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. That includes surgery, puberty blocker. I believe it includes surgery, puberty blocker, and hormone therapy. When this law was passed, the Biden Justice Department, dun dun dun, sought an injunction in the United States District Court of Tennessee to prevent the law from going into effect. So the Biden Department of Justice was trying to block Tennessee from passing this law. The district court, so the first level of the federal courts, granted that injunction, said that no, Tennessee can't put this law into effect. And
Mhm.
one of the reasons, at least according to the Wikipedia article, because I haven't read the whole opinion, the court determined that the state ban was infringing on the fundamental rights of parents to like have medical control over their children.
God, we don't give parents complete medical control over their children anyway.
Yeah, yes and no. Obviously not complete control, right?
Well, we don't allow them
Right.
to look. If you want your kid to be an opera singer, and you're like, I'm gonna fucking castrate him.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like,
Right. Right.
yeah.
That is true.
So yeah,
That is true.
it's impossible.
But there are medical procedures that are deemed to be life-saving or worthwhile, or
Yeah,
something that they
that's
can
the
have
rub.
complications, and the parent will be the ultimate decider about whether they take the risk to perform that procedure. So
Not really. I mean, look, can you, if your kid has leukemia, can you say, oh, we're gonna treat him through prayer?
no. Well, no. Actually, I don't know if it depends on states. Yeah, I know like some states, the people that are like Jehovah's Witnesses, I think, who are against blood transfusions, um, the state can say, no, we're going to give your child a blood transfusion if they need one anyway. But
Right.
no, what I
Yeah.
mean is like, if there's like a procedure and the doctors say like, oh, you have some procedure and, there's like a 20% chance that, I don't know, like if you don't do this, you'll die. But if you do it, you'll go blind or something, right? You know, you want to take the risk to do this procedure, and you're a minor, the parents get to make that decision ultimately.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. But anyway, so that was the original court ruling. They said no, this infringed on a parent's right to control their child's health. Then this went up to the appeals court, because the state appealed it, and the appeal court reversed it. The appeal court said no, in fact, the state of Tennessee can in fact pass this law, and the chief judge wrote that the right of a parent to control the medical care of their child is not a fundamental right because it's not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. Which, I mean, it's kind of true, but also I don't really like the way that's worded. That sounds kind of like, because obviously you don't want a situation where the state can just say, hey, we deem it worthwhile to just vaccinate your child against your will with the COVID vaccine, right? So we're just going to do it. We don't care what the parents say.
Right.
So it is a
That's
complicated
a
issue.
bad argument for, yeah, the nature and tradition.
Mhm.
What?
Deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. Yeah.
Oh, history and tradition.
Right. Which is strange. But then
Hmm.
now going to the sex discrimination thing, there was a judge on the court that concurred part of it and dissented part of it. And part of the dissent was they said that they thought that the Tennessee law was likely unconstitutional because of this theory of sex discrimination that we talked about earlier.
Which they're talking about. I watched a little bit of the hearing. We're not going to watch. We're going to jump in here where it just starts getting interesting. So
Mhm.
it is funny to hear all the liberal justices parrot all the trans talking points as if they're grounded in hard science, which I
Right.
just like every time I look into this stuff, it's like so tenuous, the science.
Right.
Yeah.
And so right now, this is the oral argument today. Now, the side arguing in favor of, or the side arguing to block the law, so in favor of transgender healthcare, is an ACLU attorney called Chase Strangio, who supposedly is the first transgender person to make an oral argument before the Supreme Court.
Wow. Well, they voice pass very well
They
because,
are I think they're a trans man.
oh, well, I thought it was a woman. So they pass horrible.
I guess so. That changes your opinion.
Yeah. Look, I was like, this chick sounds just like a fucking idiot. That
Well, it
whole
does
time I
sound
was
like a
thinking,
woman, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute.
yeah, look, I was like, this chick is a fucking moron. That's the whole time I was thinking, I'm like, this is a fucking the whole time in my mind I'm discriminating against women. Hilarious.
Well, I mean, I guess you technically still are.
So
So,
I guess no,
so
I'm not. I
here.
mean,
I sent
it's
you a
a
picture of what they look like. So, I mean, I think they obviously, I think they pass. I think it's much easier for women to pass as a trans man
okay. We should have
than
had this.
vice versa. But
We should. I'm not going to bring the picture up. I'll bring the picture up after you guys listen to the voice. Okay.
okay,
Here we go.
Okay.
And made the first order restriction here one that prohibits inconsistency with sex. And I just go back to the kinds of examples we give about dressing inconsistent.
Okay. There's the voice.
That's the person?
That is the person, yeah.
I mean,
That's the attorney. Unless it's a assistant or something.
maybe it's someone else. I'm just reading the wiki article here. Because I
with
mean,
sex or pursuing a profession inconsistent.
Does that sound like a man to you?
that does not sound like a man.
Does that sound like a woman to you?
Yes.
Yeah. So
I gotta do some voice training. If that is
consistent with sex, you know, I think the court's recognition that that is a sex classification.
I mean, she sounds kind of hot to me.
There you go.
And you're like, that's a trans woman. I was like, wow, she's done amazing. Oh, it's a trans man.
So it is them, because I pulled up a video of them on Democracy Now. That's what they sound like.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I gotta do some voice coaching. Okay.
Not passing.
Well, I say if you bring up the picture, I think they pass visually.
Right.
But
yeah.
as I said, I think it's pretty easy for women to transition to be men and pass visually. But yeah, the voice needs some work. Anyway, this is all nothing to do whatsoever with the court case.
It's like, yes, we have to do our standard disclaimer. I think it's fine if adults transition. I think, knock yourself out. If you're a man and you want to live as a woman, or a woman and you want to live as a man, like, feel free. The problem is the whole minor situation, because it seems, not many people knew this before there was some way to block puberty and transition people early, that gender dysphoria is rather common in adolescence. And so maybe 10% of the population gets gender dysphoria. That's like 1 in 10 people. And out of that 10% of people, 80 to 90% of the gender dysphoria that they get during adolescence resolves with puberty. So now you've got the 10% of the population that gets gender dysphoria, and 9 out of 10 of those people, it's going to fix itself once they go through puberty. One person, it's not going to fix itself, and they're going to go on to become a trans person as adults. So, but all the do-gooders in schools, they're like, we need to find these kids early because we have to transition them when they have a better chance of passing, obviously. So they'll have more societal success. A lot is dependent upon that passing thing. But instead of transitioning just the one person that's going to go on to adulthood and be transgender, they're transitioning all of them, right? So you've got 10% of the population is being transitioned before they hit puberty, when 9 of those 10 people would just lead normal lives as cis people. So that's a problem, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. So what I was gonna say is, yes, the majority of people that get gender dysphoria before they would give them puberty blockers, that gender dysphoria would go away once they went through natural puberty. Not all of them, but the majority of them. Okay.
Right.
The only
And this is evidenced by, I think it's the Tavistock Clinic. Before they did all these medical interventions, they would do talk therapy with the people. So they're the ones that discovered, okay, well, a lot of kids get this gender dysphoria. We do the talk therapy with them, and it resolves when they hit puberty. So that's where the evidence is coming from for that 80 to 90% number.
Yes. Well, and also the DSM-5 says that. I don't know if the Tavistock thing says 1 in 10. I know the DSM says it's more like 1 in 7,000 to 1 in 20,000 kids exhibit gender dysphoria.
Experience gender dysphoria.
Right.
Okay. So maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 2%, maybe it's 1%.
It's like 0.01%.
Okay. So, but it's definitely up to 10% because it's like a social contagion thing.
Well, now it might be 10%. Yeah.
Right.
I can
yeah.
believe that. So.
Okay.
Right.
So any way you want to slice it, a lot of the gender dysphoria is going to resolve with puberty. Like a lot of the goth resolves with puberty, phase. Right? Yeah. A lot of the punk rock resolves with puberty.
I mean, do we really want the goth phase to resolve? I mean, I guess we do in men, but not in women, right? Everyone wants the big titty goth girlfriend. So,
well, it doesn't resolve in all adolescents. So
okay,
that's good.
There you go. Anyway, so let's listen in.
Is obviously right, but it also can build in a layer of conformance with sex stereotypes that might be underlying those laws and that we think equally underlie this one.
So let me flip now to what it means to.
Okay, so just because we're kind of jumping in the middle here. So the argument is essentially like, so the argument against discriminating against gay people is that you're not allowed to discriminate against gay people because it's a form of sex stereotyping. Because there's no difference between a gay man and a normal man. Sorry, a normal man. What a
Oh
homophobe.
my God.
A gay man and a straight
homophobe.
man. I know. A gay man and a straight man. The only difference between the two of them is that like who they are in a romantic relationship with, and it would be a form of sex stereotyping to say or assume or declare that all men have to be in relationships or be attracted to straight women.
Mhm.
Right. So that's a form of sex stereotyping. And that was part of the legal argument that would grant, well, that does grant gay people equal rights and equal protection under the law. And so that same argument is being used to argue in favor of protecting trans people in terms of giving them all, the same protections and rights under the law.
Which is so ironic considering they're like a woman that looks like a woman. That's just a stereotype. You like, why can't a man look like a woman?
Right.
Well, you're using a completely different stereotype then, but you're still using a stereotype.
Well, the original sex stereotype, the way the sex stereotype thing came into law is because this was used to attack laws that would force women to wear dresses and specific outfits in the workplace.
Right.
So there'd be like back in the day, say like women cannot wear pants to their job. They have to wear a skirt or something. And that was like, well, you can't do that. That's a form of sex stereotyping to say that like a women have to wear a specific type of clothing. And so obviously that was a long time ago. And now the argument is kind of, it's broad enough to allow people to interpret it and use it in other ways.
Right. Yes. But it's so bizarre because it's like the male adolescent is like, I want to look like a stereotypical female.
Right.
Well, wait a second here. So you are using a stereotype.
Well, I mean, they're allowed to do it, just not their employer, the state, I guess.
Right. Well, and it's like, the rules are so different from minors because we know
Yes.
that a lot changes through adolescence.
Right.
It's like such a transformational period, and to allow them to make these kinds of decisions as minors.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
To
Anyway.
do heightened scrutiny in this area because, as you point out, this law, and I think almost all of the similar, or maybe all of the similar laws that have been passed like this, allow this exact same kind of treatment for the opposite purpose, if you will. For a person born male who wants to get to puberty already.
Right.
And you say that that's a kind of under-inclusion problem. And, it strikes me that on formal equal protection analysis, it is, unless the state can come forward with some piece of medical evidence that says that the risks are greater in the one area than in the other area, which you say Tennessee has not done. I guess what I'm asking is, like, isn't the structure of these laws going to mean that all of them are going to have to be struck down once you get to heightened scrutiny? Because
That's Justice Sotomayor speaking as well, and she's a liberal justice.
you seem to want to say, no, you can do heightened scrutiny, but you can also make certain deferential moves towards the legislature. And I guess I'm pressing you on whether that's really true.
So I think it is true. To be sure, we think that a categorical ban like this one is severely under-inclusive and also severely over-inclusive, which is an important ingredient here, and so should be invalidated. And if other states likewise have this kind of sweeping ban, then they would fail under heightened scrutiny. But I don't think that means that heightened scrutiny ties the hands of the states in this regard. One of the problems with the state's approach here is that although it has targeted this gender-affirming care for disparate treatment on the basis of sex, as we say, it has left these exact same medications entirely unregulated for all other purposes, and also turned its back on how it handles the risk-benefit calculus with respect to all other pediatric treatments. But we do think there is a real space for states to regulate here, and I point to the example of West Virginia. West Virginia was thinking about a total ban like this one on care for minors, but then the Senate Majority Leader in West Virginia, who's a doctor, looked at the underlying studies that demonstrate sharply reduced associations with suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, and the West Virginia legislature changed course and imposed a set of guardrails that are far more precisely tailored to concerns surrounding the delivery of this care. West Virginia requires that 2 different doctors diagnose the gender dysphoria and find that it's severe and that the treatment is medically necessary to guard against the risk of self-harm. The West Virginia law also requires mental health screening to try to rule out confounding diagnoses. It requires the parents to agree and the primary care physician to agree. And I think a law like that is going to fare much better under heightened scrutiny precisely because it would be tailored to the precise interests and not serve a more sweeping interest like the one asserted here in having minors appreciate their sex.
Thank you, General.
Justice Gorsuch? Justice Kavanaugh?
First, I want to ask about our role here and pick up on the Chief Justice's questions at the beginning. Who decides? I mean, you've put forth forceful policy arguments to allow these medical treatments, and Justice Sotomayor's questions elaborated on that. But the 20-plus states on the other side put forth very forceful arguments against allowing these medical treatments for minors. So it seems to me that we look to the Constitution, and the Constitution doesn't take sides on how to resolve that medical and policy debate. The Constitution's neutral on the question. At least that's one way to look at it. I want to get your reaction to that. If the Constitution doesn't take sides, if there's strong, forceful, scientific policy arguments on both sides in a situation like this, why isn't it best to leave it to the democratic process?
Well, I do think that the Constitution takes a position that individuals are entitled to equal protection of the law, and I totally understand the force of your intuition that states need space to regulate and to try to take into account concerns like adolescent health. We're not denying that that's an important interest here, but when you look at how this law actually operates, what it is doing is denying individual plaintiffs the ability to access medications on the basis of their sex. And that doesn't mean that the states are disabled from taking into account the actual biological differences between males and females, but that has to be channeled to the heightened scrutiny stage. And I think that there would be a real danger in this court looking ahead essentially and saying we think there might be benign justifications here, or we think that states should have some flexibility in this regard to overlook the facial sex classification in the statute. If you are concerned, Justice Kavanaugh, about moving too fast in this space and maybe restricting the ability of states to take a close look at these issues, I think the court could write a very narrow opinion in this case, and the court could say simply that when you prohibit conduct that's inconsistent with sex, that is a sex-based line, so you do have to apply heightened scrutiny. But the court has made clear that that's an intermediate standard, and if the state can come forward with an important interest and substantiate that it needed to draw those sex-based lines to substantially serve the interest, that's going to be okay.
Keep going, sorry.
And the final point is, then you can send it back and let the Sixth Circuit grapple with this in the first instance.
On the sex discrimination point, I guess picking up on Justice Kagan's questions, I mean, the way you would think about this is, I guess, it prohibits all boys and girls from transitioning using certain medical treatments, and it doesn't say only boys can do so or only girls can do so.
Well, I think the problem with trying to put that transitioning label on it as a basis to avoid the sex classification is that transition itself is inherently tied to sex. In other words, the prohibited purpose here are those treatments that would allow a minor to live and identify inconsistent with sex, and the statute would permit anyone to have those treatments for the non-prohibited purpose, which again is when it's consistent with sex. The court has said many times that labels don't control in this space, and I think when you have that kind of purpose that's expressly defined using sex-based line drawing, you have to recognize that for what it is.
And no matter how you articulate the standard, whether it's rational basis or intermediate scrutiny, it'll come down to whether the state, and I think you said this, has sufficient justification for limiting these treatments for minors. And the state says its justification here is health and safety for minors. You say there are benefits from allowing these treatments, but there are also harms, right, from allowing these treatments. At least the state says so, including lost fertility, the physical and psychological effects on those who later change their mind and want to detransition, which I don't think we can ignore. We can't ignore what you're talking about and what Justice Sotomayor raised. I agree with that, but you can't ignore, I think, the risks on the other side of the balance. So even if it is intermediate scrutiny or rational basis, those justifications for the state, how do we as a court choose which set of risks is more serious in deciding whether to constitutionalize this whole area?
So let me react to a couple of different points you brought up. First of all, I do think that
Well, let me interrupt for a second. The thing that kind of bothers me about the whole conversation that isn't really probably going to be addressed is that normally I would be on the side of you want to try to keep the government away from people doing medical procedures for themselves and even for their children if the medical community, it's like a normal procedure that the medical community and everyone involved, signs off on. But the problem with this one specifically is that this is an example where, at least to my interpretation of the facts, the medical community has become completely corrupted on this topic, or maybe not the medical community as a whole, but the medical community that's involved with providing gender dysphoric care and transitioning is completely corrupt on this topic. And so, I'm looking at this as a situation like should the government be involved in a way that's very narrowly tailored to this specific field without kind of giving a broad ruling on everything else? And if so, should the judgment be based on the fact that the medical literature on this is so actually scant if you get into it, or scant if you look into it?
Yeah. I mean, I would solve the issue by putting pressure on the doctors doing these procedures. I would just say I would work on the laws about suing doctors as a detransitioner, because then you would have a bunch of doctors that would think twice about doing this stuff. So they'd have to be on firmer medical ground.
Well, I'm assuming that people already can sue doctors. I don't
I
know.
don't think
I would
they
imagine
can.
they could.
Look, the medical lobby has been in Congress for so long, and they've
Yes,
just
yes.
destroyed like all of the laws about suing doctors for any sort of medical
Right, right.
malpractice have been watered down to nothing. So it's like it's some minor insurance payout. You need to install a real check and balance there so that the doctors are weary. It's the same thing that's happening on the abortion side, right? They're saying, the doctors are going to suffer some ramification for doing an unlawful abortion. So doctors are saying, well, look, I don't want to do that abortion because I'm scared I'm going to end up in legal jeopardy. They need to do the same thing with the trans stuff.
No, you could be right, and that could be if the court rules against Tennessee and says that they can't have, a law like this, or broadly as a law like this, then you might actually see. I mean, it would be ironic because it's generally there. It was in the past. I don't know what's like now, but in the past, it was almost always the Republican Party that was being lobbied by the medical associations across the country to put medical malpractice
Oh, I'm sure
caps
their fingerprints are
yeah,
all over
in
this
place.
shit.
Yes, in
Yeah.
place that would make it so that if you sued if you had a lawsuit against a doctor, there's a cap. But I bet you that they, overwhelmingly in these red states, Republicans would be willing to carve out an exception for those caps in regards to, someone who detransitioned or had some problem with gender dysphoric care.
Yeah, right now the doctors kind of have a open season to just experiment, and that's unfortunately a lot of doctors' dreams. They're like,
Right.
I want to see where this goes. They're curious minded, right?
Terrible.
Yeah, it is terrible. It's
I think
totally terrible.
I think a lot of doctors It's just like they learned something in school or wherever they were taught, and then it's just like that's the gospel, and it's very difficult for them to take in new information after they get out of school going forward.
Well,
Like doctors, like good doctors are
there's
supposed to keep reading medical journals and to keep updating their information and stuff. I don't know. I feel like most doctors don't actually engage in that behavior.
I don't think you can cite studies that are over 5 years old in the medical community, and they're forced to constantly do so many hours of training for new procedures and whatnot a year to maintain their license. There's a lot of
Right.
stuff in place for them to keep learning. So, but I do agree. Obviously, people get set in their ways. So, but yeah, this has gotta something has to be done so that there is some legal ramification of all this because they're just the certitude that they have is completely unwarranted in my estimation, and
Right.
they pull out. It's interesting that the justices pull out all the old chestnuts of like the suicide and stuff like that. When I mean, the like depression is super high in adolescence. There's all kinds of reasons for adolescents to be suicidal aside from gender dysphoria. So it's like as a class, it has a lot of emotional and mental problems. So it's weird that they put so much weight on this gender dysphoria stuff.
Mr. Middleman for $2 says early and straight for once. Yes. Listen, it was just a coincidence that this is the topic that we're covering. Mr. Middleman for $2 says Adam's Doomer cosplay is on point. Look at that. Are you cold?
Yeah.
Is it cold in California?
It is a little cold, yeah.
Okay. It's a little cold in here too. I might be wearing a blanket. J Mac, our far, thanks so much for the $20. Says I should talk to my brother about this. Yeah, that would be interesting.
Oh, he's in Tennessee, right?
In Tennessee, yeah. True Powers A, thanks so much for 22 months. Says I'm late. Is this AOC talking? No, this is Chase Strangio, ACLU attorney, the first transgender man to make an oral argument before the Supreme Court.
Right. We brought a picture of him up so you can look.
You can see what
The
they look
voice might be a little bit deceiving.
a little jarring, yeah. Grams for $5 says, what is the name of the case? And the case is United States versus Skrmetti, Skrmetti. Mike Hunt for $2 says, can you shout out my friend Wilma Fingerdew? Consider yourself shouted out, Wilma.
Did you miss Mr. Ubercross or did I miss it?
Oh, I did miss it. Thank you. Mr. Bacross, thanks so much for the $10. Says the question isn't whether trans people are real or if those surgeries are good. The question is, can a state pass a law like this or does the law violate the Constitution? Yes, that is the way that is the argument. Yes.
Well, they're
true.
trying to make it unconstitutional by saying that it's discriminatory based on sex. So,
right. But I think you could make an argument that you can say that even if the law is discriminatory, even if the law discriminates on sex grounds, which it would technically, it's still worthwhile for the state to do because of the harm that it could do to minors.
yeah, the potential harm is great. I mean, you could be screwing up somebody's life, their entire life from adolescence, which is just, I mean, that's a travesty. It's weird because so many people on the left will just say, oh, they just live their life as a trans person and that's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with having more trans people. And I just think, aren't you the ones talking about how difficult life is for trans people? I mean, isn't that your whole thing?
Right.
Yeah.
I would, what's it called? It's a compelling state interest or something. I forget what it's called. Something like that, Mr. Bacross. I would think that the state could make an argument that they have a compelling state interest to protect
protect the
minors,
well-being of minors.
that if the surgeries do not show efficacy or there's a lot of question about them, that it would be a justification for violating someone's rights on the grounds of sex discrimination.
Right.
So, but let me know if that is incorrect, because I'm not sure. Naxos for $5 says, I'm consistently disagreed with you all on this issue. I think the treatment should be sex segregated with only males being able to get less than 18-year-old hormones. Males, why? What is the rationale? I'm not sure I understand the rationale for that. Gene, the angry payment for $5 says the medical community signed off on eugenics and lobotomies as well. That is true. Most of our medicine sits on the shoulders of countless dead from bad medicine. That is the issue, yeah. And I do think that a lot of trans healthcare will be seen as
Yeah.
shock treatment, and lobotomies were kind of seen once, there's like a time period where like they're a craze and then they fall out of favor and they become very narrowly used for, properly after that. 40-second Guardian for $10 says these problems are all over multiple industries, a lack of legal consequences for poor or no quality assurance of goods and services, whether for lack of care or lack of focusing on it for politics. Yeah, I agree. That's why I agree completely with that. And this is why I have sort of an issue with the kind of laissez-faire attitude about like, don't have anything
Regulation.
be regulated, just let, the free market handle everything. Because I think it kind of breeds these sorts of lack of legal consequence situations, though you could argue and would be right to some degree that some of the lack of legal consequences for medicine is not a free market issue, but is a government issue because of, the Republican Party for so many years putting in all these caps for malpractice suits. Eric Diota for 5 Canadian says, Adam, you have no idea what cold is. There you go.
True. Yeah, I know. That's why I'm tepid about it, because I admit that I get super demotivated when it gets cold. It's one of the reasons I live in Southern California. It's I don't like living in these cold places where half the year I don't feel like I can do anything because I just want to sit in bed and stay warm.
Anyway, let's continue.
That the standard of review very much matters. And the court has made clear that rational basis is an entirely forgiving standard. It applies to, mundane economic regulation where there's no reason for courts to take a closer look. So I think the court should hold the line that anytime the state classifies based on sex, you do need to take a look at that. But I totally take the point that, of course, when a state is coming forward with an important interest like protecting adolescent health, that may well justify the lines the state has drawn. And it's not about asking courts to step
right. That was exactly what I was saying.
Courts to step in and make a first order determination about how to weigh risks and benefits. But I do think that the state is under a basic obligation to first substantiate its concern. And here there were extensive factual findings by the district court that many of the risks that the state was asserting are not uniquely tied to gender affirming care at all. And also to take into account.
So to be clear, so that's kind of an interesting argument that this is what the attorney arguing in favor of getting rid of the law is saying that maybe the states would have the right to limit the procedure on a finding basis of if it's found scientifically or through the data that the procedures are bad or something. And they're just saying that the state did not actually show evidence of that when they passed this law. So
The harms that would come from categorically banning access to medications on the basis of drugs, including the benefits that I was discussing with Justice Sotomayor. You mentioned fertility and regret, and I'd like to take both of those concerns head on. I do want to acknowledge that there is evidence to suggest that gender-affirming care with respect to hormones can have some impacts on fertility. Critically, puberty blockers have no effect in and of themselves on fertility, so I don't think that concern can justify the ban on puberty blockers, which is just pressing pause on someone's endogenous puberty to give them more time to understand their identity.
That fucking can't be true. That can't be true. Because it's at some point, you can't go on puberty blockers for the rest of your life. Like at some point, it starts doing tangible damage to you. So without saying puberty blockers for 2 months or 6 months or whatever it is before you start doing bodily harm to the person, that has to be included.
With respect to hormone use, there are some effects on fertility, but the court found that many individuals who are transgender remain fertile after taking these medications. They can conceive biological children. There are fertility preservation measures that they can undertake, and that they have to be counseled on those risks. And as I said before, I can understand that that could be a hard trade-off, but it's not unique to this care. There are other treatments for adolescents that likewise affect fertility, including some of those that SB 1 expressly permits, like on intersex intersex individuals who often have surgeries as infants that might permanently affect their fertility. I would also say that if you are concerned about fertility, there are measures the state could undertake, like requiring warnings, more informed counseling, trying to ensure that there's informed consent in this area. You also mentioned the possibility.
I hate that they use the intersex example just because it's like you're talking about healthy children here who have absolutely no ailments whatsoever.
Of regret. The record evidence demonstrates that the rates of regret are very low because for the population that has access to this treatment, so these are adolescents who have marked and sustained gender dysphoria that has worsened with the onset of puberty, they are very likely to persist in their gender identity. But if you're thinking about this from the standpoint of there's no harm in just making them wait until they're adults, I think you have to recognize that the effect of denying this care is to produce irreversible physical effects that are consistent with their birth sex, because they have to go through puberty before they turn 18. So essentially what this law is doing is saying we're going to make all adolescents in the state develop the physical secondary sex characteristics consistent with their gender or with their sex assigned at birth, even though that might significantly worsen gender dysphoria, increase the risk of suicide, and I think critically make it much harder to live and be accepted in their gender identity as an adult. Because if you're requiring someone to undergo a male puberty and they develop an Adam's apple, that's going to be hard to reverse, and they're more likely to be identified as transgender and subject to discrimination and harassment as adults. So I think the relevant question is, you have this population of adolescents and there are documented very essential benefits for a large number of them, and maybe a small number that will regret this care just like with any other medical care. But for the state to come in and just say across the board, you can't have the medication because of your birth sex, we don't think that's a tailored law.
I wish they could compare the detransitioners to the people who are happy with transition and just see which is more, because I bet it's so many more false positives than people who are actually happy that they made the decision.
You acknowledge there is some group, though, who later changes their mind and wants to detransition. That doesn't defeat your case. I just want to make sure you acknowledge there is, as a factual matter, some group of people.
Yes, we're certainly not denying that some people might detransition or regret this care, but all of the available evidence shows that it's a very small number.
Then to pick up on the Chief Justice and Justice Alito's questions, it's obviously evolving debate. I mean, just in the last couple of years in Europe, there's big changes in terms of how they're thinking about it and how they're thinking about these risks and benefits that you and I have just been talking about and you've been elaborating. If it's evolving like that and changing, and England's pulling back and Sweden's pulling back, it strikes me as, pretty heavy yellow light, if not red light, for this court to come in, the 9 of us, and to constitutionalize the whole area when the rest of the world, or at least the people the countries that have been at the forefront of this, are, pumping the brakes on this kind of treatment because of concerns about the risks.
We certainly are not asking the court to set forth some bright line constitutional rules in this space that is going to really take further debate and evaluation of regulatory options away from states. We think, as I mentioned, that the court really only needs to decide the first order question here of whether this law classifies based on sex. I think that's entirely distinct from some of the concerns you've identified about what justifications the state has.
Do you think that West Virginia law you mentioned is constitutional?
I think it would likely satisfy heightened scrutiny. It hasn't been subject to adversarial testing because I don't think anyone has sued to challenge it, so I haven't looked at the record that West Virginia would build, but I do think that there is room here for states to enact tailored measures to try to guard against the kind of risks that you're concerned about and that the state has identified.
And
So they are making the argument, he's making the argument that the only issue that they want, that the ACLU wants the court to really focus on is this law discriminatory on sex? And they want that because from a plain reading, it would seem to be that it is discriminatory on sex. I mean, it's designed to be discriminatory by sex. And so that's why they want to focus on that. And then that's why the justice, I believe that was Kavanaugh, asked that kind of interesting question where he was like, well, wait a minute, you were praising the West Virginia law earlier, but isn't that law also discriminatory on sex? Like, just because you say that, you have to have two doctors sign off on it, how's that not also discriminatory on sex? And so the answer they gave right there, I mean, they didn't really address that. They just kind of just said, "Oh, it's fine," So
Yeah, it is the transgender person, the person that will go on to be a transgender adult's interests against the interest of the general population who is not going to go on to be a transgender adult. They're caught up in some identity experimentation as an adolescent, that is what adolescence is all about. So
right.
it's just super fucked up for her to say, oh, well, it's just a few of them that get thrown on the train tracks of life. But it's in the better interest of my community. My community comes out on top.
Well, yeah, and I mean, to me, and the transcript for this isn't available yet because it takes a while for YouTube to generate them for these long streams, but so I can't search. I don't know. I'm hoping that one of the justices brings up and asks a question about desistance, because to me, that's a pretty prime important. That's like a
They
key
don't
piece
know
of
this stuff, though.
information, right? Well, no, but before you gave kids puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, the desistance rate was super high.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so
if the state has that information and includes it in whatever documentation they've
I
given
would
to the court.
hope they do. Yeah.
Yeah, but look,
I don't know. I mean,
I'm not certain that they
okay.
do.
Right.
It just it's oh God, it disgusts me to my core that they're willing to do that. They're like, oh, it's a very small percentage of people that get totally fucked over by this procedure. So, and we find that morally acceptable because we're trying to save the trans people. Oh God, it's revolting to me. It's like, call me when you have some sort of test that you can do that's foolproof, right? When there's no one is going to be thrown under the bus. Isn't the obligation for you when you want to do some sort of crazy medical intervention to prove that you're not doing it on people who don't need it? Like, can you imagine if cancer was determined this way? Oh, there's about a 60% chance that you have cancer, so we're just going to give you chemotherapy anyway. It's like, it's insane. It's totally insane. Do you agree, or do you have
I agree.
Yeah. Okay.
And last topic on the heightened review, and you say all we need to do is do heightened review, and that's kind of a minimal step. I mean, I'm not sure really that the follow-on effects of that could be pretty significant. I think Justice Kagan alluded to that in her question, or at least raised that as a question. And I want to ask in particular about one thing. If you prevail here on the standard of review, what would that mean for women's and girls' sports? In particular, would transgender athletes have a constitutional right, as you see it, to play in women's and girls' sports, basketball, swimming, volleyball, track, et cetera, notwithstanding the competitive fairness and safety issues that have been vocally raised by some female athletes seen in the amicus brief of the many women athletes in this case? So can you explain how intermediate scrutiny would apply to women's sports?
Yes, and just as a threshold clarifying point, I want to be clear that when it comes to access to sex-separated spaces like sports and bathrooms, courts already recognize that those are facial sex classifications that trigger heightened scrutiny. So it's actually not the question teed up here about how to classify the law in the first place or how to identify whether it's a sex classification. Instead, that's taken as given in that litigation, and the entire focal point of the disputes in those cases has been, well, does the state have an important governmental interest, and does it need to draw the lines to exclude transgender people?
Right, but how would intermediate scrutiny, which we may not, if we went to intermediate scrutiny, there's a possibility we would apply it here. How would it apply to, in your view, and maybe you don't have fully informed views, which would be fine, but how do you think it would apply to sports?
So courts have split on that issue, and I hesitate to try in in a vacuum without an actual factual record to try to opine on the state's justification and whether it will satisfy that standard. It's obviously a different set of governmental interests that are being asserted there, and those would have to be analyzed in their own right. But I think that this court, if it wants to preserve space to make clear that nothing here should be understood to affect the separate questions that are arising there, the court could very well do so, and we would have no objection to explicit language saying this decision does not in any way or should not be understood to affect the separate state interests there that have to be evaluated on their own terms.
Okay,
That's hilarious. That's totally hilarious. It's like, you can side with us. It's no big deal. Just put a little note in there saying it doesn't apply to anything else. He's what- he- It's politically what she's doing is very astute. Yeah.
Right.
She's like,
Right.
look, I want to win the case here. It's not going to really affect anything else. But
Mhm.
you know it would. People would totally point to it.
Well, I
They-
mean, you could. That's what I mean. They could theoretically try to craft a super narrow, way to interpret this. But
Right, yeah.
But looking ahead, do you think it's logically possible, as a matter of constitutional decision-making, to say that laws like the one at issue here do not satisfy intermediate scrutiny, but laws that restrict women's and girls' sports in a way that transgender athletes cannot participate would satisfy intermediate scrutiny? Is that logically possible?
Oh, yes, definitely. So we do think intermediate scrutiny applies in both contexts, but there are a different set of state interests at play. And I think one readily apparent difference is that in the context of sports, there are arguments made that that affects the rights of cisgender women, and that the ability to allow transgender women to compete on those teams is going to be other regarding in the sense of having those external impacts. There's nothing like this here. Allowing transgender individuals who have carefully thought about this and consulted with their parents and their medical team to access these medications that have health benefits recognized here and abroad in no way affects the rights of other people. And so I think
If your gender dysphoria isn't going to desist naturally, that's the big difference. It's the same exact thing as the sports. It is.
Mhm.
You're taking cis people and medicalizing them for their entire lives when they have a condition that would solve itself with puberty.
Right, they could, yeah, in most cases.
Yeah,
Right.
it's the same exact thing. It is. You're throwing the cis people under the bus for your interests, for
Well, and
your
also,
personal interests.
right, and I guess another, argument. This wouldn't necessarily apply to. I don't know how much this would apply to this case. Is I don't believe for a second. Like the big problem with the way this is treated is it's not like the doctors are not saying, "Oh, according to our data, if we do nothing, your child will have a 60 to 90% chance of being fine and just curing themselves when they go through puberty." They're not
Yeah, they're
telling
not
parents that.
telling them that. If
Right.
they were, this conversation wouldn't even be happening.
Right. They're telling parents like, "Oh, your child has a super heightened chance of,
Committing suicide. Yeah.
and if you don't do anything about it."
Yeah. Yes. It's easier just to deal with the depression. Have them talking to a therapist once a week and let the gender dysphoria resolve with puberty.
Mhm.
Yeah. If you're worried about the suicide thing, keep an eye on them.
court could well understand the statute here to fail intermediate scrutiny, even if it would survive there.
Do you know what intermediate scrutiny is and strict scrutiny? I don't know these terms.
I did
So
at some point, but I could look it up.
I know it's a technicality.
Strict scrutiny is a form of judicial review that courts in the United States use to determine the constitutionality of a government action that burdens a fundamental right involving a suspect classification. So like race, religion, something like
Mhm.
that.
But there's some intermediate scrutiny, I guess, where it only applies in certain cases. Strict scrutiny, I guess, would mean it's categorically.
So strict scrutiny is like the strongest form of judicial review that requires the
Right.
government to demonstrate a very compelling interest to use the least restrictive means possible to achieve whatever the law is trying to achieve.
Mhm.
While intermediate scrutiny is a less stringent standard where the government must show an appropriate, important interest and that the law is substantially related to achieving that interest.
Right.
So it's basically just saying like how
much do
s-
they want it? Yeah.
well, like how So strict scrutiny is like the highest level. Like that's like the most rigorous level that you'd have to really show it's like how super compelling it is for the government to restrict someone's rights in a
Right. Yes.
in a
Yeah.
law.
So you'd have to show that the outcomes were going to be massive in terms of like harm or societal harm or individual harm or anything like that. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
Morning, General. I want to pick up on one of Justice Kavanaugh's early questions. You know, he pointed out that the burdens of the law fall equally on boys and girls because neither can transition. And you responded that it's kind of the sex classification or the expectations that one will conform to one's, biological or gender assigned at birth. Why isn't that more of an Arlington Heights argument about intentional discrimination than if what you're really
What?
What happened?
I don't know. They
Oh.
just said it's a private.
There's like a bunch of different.
And you can see that if you
there.
look at how the law applies to some of the individual plaintiffs. Take Ryan Rowe, who is one of the individual plaintiffs here. He wants to take testosterone in order to live and identify as a boy. And
It's not working for you, or?
No, it went back to working.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
working for you.
Yeah.
I just want to say, I want to add. So, when it comes to like race issues, so something that would be discriminatory based on a race issue, it would be strict scrutiny. So, like the example given is a law that would ban interracial marriage would be subject to strict scrutiny. Like the government really have to show like a super compelling reason to discriminate on race grounds. But supposedly gender is subject to intermediate scrutiny and not strict scrutiny.
Right.
So it's easier for the government to make laws that discriminate on the basis of gender than race.
Right. Interesting. That makes sense.
If I'm saying anything wrong,
Yeah.
Supercross, let me know. Let me know.
he's prohibited by SB 1 from doing so because his birth sex was female. But if you change Ryan's birth sex and suppose he was assigned male at birth, then SB 1's restriction lifts. So he is not being treated the same as a boy, who was assigned male at birth. And I think that is the kind of quintessential test the court has applied.
God, I hate the fact that they say assigned at birth. Just
Yes.
gets under my skin.
Well, it's weird because it is a total conflation of the idea that like the transgender stuff. Remember the conversation was, oh, we're not. It's like you're changing your gender, not your sex, right? But then when
Yeah.
you say assigned at birth, then you're like, well, wait a minute. So you are making an argument that there isn't birth sex?
Yeah, if you want to say gender assigned at birth, maybe, but not
Right.
sex. Sex is observed at birth.
JMac or Circuit Far, thanks so much, JMac, for the $200.
Wow, look at that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Says, I called my brother and he said he thinks it will be upheld based on prohibitive laws in place that concern children. Also, the Supreme Court is leaning heavily conservative. Obviously, I asked him if this would affect other corrective cosmetic surgeries regarding kids. He doesn't believe so. Yeah, no, I would, if I had to guess, just purely based on the makeup of this current Supreme Court, I would assume they're going to lean conservative and they would allow this. They'll find some way to allow the law to, continue to exist. That'd be my guess.
Even when they're using these puberty blockers, I've heard they use them so that men can be taller or boys can be taller, because if they play around with when puberty hits or how long puberty persists, that affects how tall you end up being. They don't do it to make people short, right? They do it to make people taller. The objective is to make people like more physically attractive, right?
Yeah. Well, yes, that is part. What you're talking about for precocious puberty?
Yeah.
Yes, that is the point. Part of it, I believe, is also like weird health. It's not just like cosmetic. I think there's also like weird health defects that occur for some reason if you go through precocious puberty. So,
Right. Someone who listens to the show ended up commenting and saying that they did this and were supposed to become much taller than they actually did, and were upset that it didn't really work as well as they had hoped. So, which is interesting. Like, I didn't even know that was a thing.
right.
That they do this so that you can be taller.
That's interesting.
It is
Uh,
interesting. Yeah.
Dr. Fire for 28 Canadian, thank you. Says here in Canada, the Remmer brothers got royally screwed up by John Money. Even our very liberal state broadcaster CBC program, The Fifth Estate, did a documentary on it decades ago before it became so politically charged. Yeah, it is so bizarre because there's like a time period where John Money completely lied about his experimentation. I think that's the only way you could describe it on the Reamer brothers in terms of like trying to transition a child who didn't even have gender dysphoria, just had like a botched circumcision. And based on the idea that gender was a pure social construct and you could just change someone's gender by conditioning, and it completely didn't work. He lied and said it did work. And for like a time period, everyone in the medical community was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then finally, when it came out, I think like a decade or 2 decades later, that he just totally lied and that the kid was miserable and he ended up killing himself. That there was like a complete backlash against this. And then I don't know, then suddenly that all got forgotten, like 8 years ago when all the transgender stuff kind of like exploded.
Yeah, because it's politically inconvenient for them. It really is.
Yeah.
They're in the same boat as John Money. They want to believe this gender is a spectrum and fully malleable.
Right.
Applied for purposes of identifying when there's a sex classification.
So what would your argument be if a new drug is developed within, say, 2 or 3 years that just the only purpose of the drug, there's no precocious puberty purpose or anything like that. The only reason to give this drug is it targets minors who have gender dysphoria particularly. And a state passes a law, the FDA approves it, so it's available in some states, but a state passes a law saying no one has access to it. So now you don't have that whole thing falls out.
Yeah. So that would not be a facial sex classification. And there I do think that you would have to apply an Arlington Heights type of analysis to see whether the context and history demonstrate that actually the state was intending to treat people differently based on their sex. But I think that would function very differently from
Why
SB1.
don't you have an Arlington Heights argument here too? Because I take it one thing you think would be wrong with.
I mean, like if you had like a hypothetical scenario where there is a drug, let's say there's a drug you give women who get bad period cramps or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it would
Discrimination.
right, no, and it would cure the period cramps. But if a man took it, it would like get them high, but cause some like detrimental,
Right.
physical disability, down the road. And so you passed a law to try to make it illegal for males to have access to this drug or something, right?
Right.
I mean, could you be like, well, that's sex
Sex
discrimination? Like,
discrimination.
I don't know. It
Look,
seems like
I think
there's a
the
way
whole
around
sex
it.
discrimination is bullshit. I think that the whole argumentation on sex, this being some sort of sex discrimination, just seems bunk to me.
Well, the problem is, I agree with you in this context. It's not, but the problem is that I agree that it is sex discrimination in terms of, what women wear and like discriminating against gay people. And so it's just using the same logic. So you kind of like the courts have to figure out a way to differentiate between that logic and applying it to trans people or trans youth, I should say specifically.
Yeah, in the form of dressing though, there's no harm to anyone. This is like tangible harm to people.
Right. But that's so I guess you have to say like that the physical harm overrides, the quote right for a person to do this.
Right,
That
yeah.
allows the state to discriminate on the basis of sex or something.
I thought that's what we were talking about.
Right. That
It
would be
seems like that's what everyone is
scrutiny,
talking
the
about.
intermediate scrutiny. Yeah.
That's why I think the sex discrimination argument is so ridiculous, because it's irrelevant to the argument on detransitioning and physical harm, because it doesn't matter if you're a trans man or a trans woman.
Right. Well, I
in
don't
the
know what
same
Tennessee's
situation.
argument is because I haven't heard it. So maybe I don't know if they just try to subvert it or if they have an actual argument about the sex discrimination thing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we'll find out.
That law is the stereotyping function.
Well, I think that Arlington Heights doesn't seem like the natural doctrinal home for a law like SB1 that says on its face you can't act inconsistent with sex. And I take your point about that's applying some equal rules to boys and girls, but that's true anytime you have a law that says you can't act inconsistent with a characteristic. That means that there's going to be a restriction on males and a restriction on females. It's true of any other factor too, inconsistent with race, inconsistent with religion. You might say, well, that's not just singling out one religion or one race or one sex for disparate treatment, but I think it actually increases the number of classifications when you're applying parallel restrictive rules on the basis of a protected characteristic across the board.
So let me return to Justice Kagan's questions. She asked you whether really the more natural way to think about this is that it is discriminating on the basis of transgender status rather than, I feel like trying to make the Bostock-like argument, holding all things equal, or that you have to do this by reference to, biological sex, feels like an odd way to solve the problem, and kind of that hypothetical I gave you about the drug that just has the transitioning purpose. So if we just head-on confront the question which you raise in the second part of your brief about whether transgender status should be a suspect class, one question I have is, at least as far as I can think of, we don't have a history of de jure, or that I know of, we don't have a history of de jure discrimination against transgender people, right? You point out in your brief that in the last 3 years there have been these laws. But before that, we might have had private societal discrimination. But I don't know of, but is there a history that I don't know about where we have de jure discrimination? And my concern about it is this: all of the other suspect classes that we've recognized so far do have that long de jure history of discrimination. And, the Equal Protection Clause applies to state action, so it feels like an odd fit to say that in their private lives, people have discriminated against transgender people. Therefore, we're going to treat it as a suspect class for purposes of the Equal Protection Clause.
So I think you may be right that the discrimination, historical discrimination against transgender people may not have been reflected in the laws, but I think there's no dispute that there is a broad history here, and it hasn't just been confined to private actors. I think that if you actually looked at the facts, there's a wealth of evidence to suggest that transgender people throughout history have been subjected to violence and discrimination and maybe lost employment opportunities or housing opportunities, even in contexts where there might be state public employment at play. And of course, that's especially reflected now in the law, where there has been this, I think, attention and focus on trying to limit transgender people from being able to live and identify consistent with their gender identity in our society. So I don't even understand the state to be disputing the historical discrimination point. But if you're approaching this from the standpoint of saying, is this a group with a distinguishing characteristic that has no bearing on their ability to contribute and that needs some protection from the courts, I think if any group qualifies, this one does in light of the current laws and what might come in the future. And our basic argument is, if you can look ahead and say, maybe the states will ban medical care for adults who are transgender, maybe they'll ban adoption by transgender people or not allow them to be teachers, that doesn't look anything like the workaday economic regulation that just gets rational basis review. And I think the court could give effect to that intuition.
Yeah, and I don't want to be misunderstood to say that I don't think there's a problem or that there hasn't been private discrimination. I guess it doesn't seem analogous to me to say race or gender or national origin, those kinds of things, because we did have de jure discrimination to point to. And so I guess what I'm thinking is, when we are in the business of identifying suspect classes, in Cleburne, we expressed, and I'm not saying that this is analogous to Cleburne in that respect, but we expressed in Cleburne hesitancy, to identify groups such as the elderly, or the mentally disabled as suspect classes, in part because those are judgments that are pretty hard for courts to make. And at least de jure discrimination of the sort experienced by women, or people on the basis of race, gives us something to point to if we're going to be identifying a new suspect class, which we haven't done for a long time.
Yeah, and I, of course, take that point.
All this seems completely irrelevant to the fact that we're talking about children here. So it's really a question of whether or not they are transgender.
It's not irrelevant to the strict legal argument about how to figure out this question of whether it's sex discrimination. Because essentially, I believe what the justice is asking, which is an interesting question, is, in U.S. history, there's been multiple examples in our history of discrimination on sex and race and religion and the, you know, the protected classes that we have enshrined in law throughout our history. But there wasn't really an example of any discrimination until recently. Of like, we don't have a history of discriminating against trans people because that wasn't a thing until recently that people really talked about or acknowledged. So there wasn't legal discrimination against that. So I guess the question would be like, does the law, you know, could the laws protect this thing that no one even really thought about or didn't really exist in law until recently?
Because the cases were so minor. Look, if someone gets fired, if a school teacher gets fired because they're transgender, then you're pointing to a specific act of discrimination, though. But this is
No,
completely
no.
different.
What I'm saying is like, until I don't even know when they started doing. I don't even know when like the concept of transgenderism even like entered into the conversation at all. And so they're saying is like because it was only recently that any laws or anything had to do with being transgender. There's no like history that really shows that these laws that are protecting for sex discrimination should have anything to do with transgender people. I think is what they're arguing.
Right. Because transgenderism hasn't been singled out as a protected class yet.
Because there
Is
wasn't,
that
yeah,
the
because there
question?
wasn't law, there wasn't really, there's no history of laws, you know, attacking transgender people until recently. And so how can the laws that
Right.
protect sex have anything to do? I
So
think that's what
there's
they're
no
arguing.
so there's
That's,
no court cases like the one where the guy got fired from, or the trans woman got fired from the funeral home.
well, no, there is, but okay. What they're saying is like, so when that court case that I talked about came up where the woman was suing because she couldn't wear pants, right?
Right.
It was like in US law, there had been many laws that were already discriminating on people on the basis of their sex, on the basis of being a woman or a man
Right.
already. So when that law was created that said women can be treated equally or people have to be treated equally, like
It covered transgenderism.
it would cover male and female. It wouldn't necessarily cover transgenderism because no one was like that wasn't a thing, is what they're saying.
Well, it does inadvertently if it says anyone can wear pants. That you can't.
Yes, but they're not suing to wear pants, right?
Right. Well, this just is completely different because the situation is completely different. You're talking about an adolescent who's discovering who they are.
Right.
And this is the kind of like commitment most people believe adolescents aren't capable of making, right?
Right.
That's the problem here. So it has nothing to do with, but she's arguing that it's discrimination to not give them access to this medical treatment that will, the decision whether or not to engage in that medical treatment they'll carry around for the rest of their lives.
Right.
So
Well, Clarence Thomas in the beginning asked the question of, do the drugs have different effects on a boy or a girl? So seems like he's trying to reason that you can limit, you know, provide some kind of limitation because the drugs themselves have this different biological effect, so they have to
Right.
be treated differently.
We all know how he's going to decide, right?
Well, yeah, obviously we know what he's going to decide.
I was surprised to hear him speak for as long as he did.
Right.
Point, and I should reiterate, we don't think the court has to confront it here, but in the cases involving age and disability, I understand the court to have approached those issues with somewhat different reasoning, that age is something we all experience, that disability is a broad and diverse group, and that individuals with disabilities have been able to harness the majoritarian political forces to protect their rights, and none of that is true here. Transgender individuals are a discrete minority. I think there's no dispute that they are being subject to a wave of legislation across the states today. And I think that this is the kind of circumstance where the court could rightly recognize that heightened scrutiny should apply.
Last question.
See, I don't know the legislation that they're being subjected to. I don't know if that legislation is against transgender adults or if it's just addressing the specific problem with minors, which I think is a completely separate issue.
This one for this court case, the Tennessee law is just about minors.
Minors, I know, yeah, but she just said like transgender people are being discriminated against by all of these laws that are coming out.
Right.
I would not, like, this law does not discriminate against him.
Yes.
Correct. because he's an adult,
Right.
a transgender adult.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
But I think they would look at it differently. They would say that even a law targeting a minor is discriminating against transgenders as a category.
Well, yeah, and I mean that's why I was also kind of Thomas asked, how do you not interpret this as a
An age thing,
discrimination
yeah.
on gender the same way you have tons of laws. I mean, on age instead of gender, because we have
Yeah.
tons of laws that have age restrictions to them, like
Yep.
drinking and stuff like that.
Yep. That's the way they're going to decide it, guaranteed.
you agree with me that the resolution of this case has no impact on the parental rights claim that the Sixth Circuit also addressed?
That's right. I think we are not making a substantive due process parental rights claim here, and this court obviously didn't grant review of that issue. I will say that I think parental rights are actually relevant to the Equal Protection Clause as well, insofar as it's significant to me that Tennessee, in choosing to categorically ban this care, is taking a sharp turn away from how it ordinarily handles parental rights in the medical decision-making space. And Justice Kavanaugh said, who decides here? But when it comes to medical risks and benefits, the state's general approach is to say parents get to decide along with their doctors and their children. And so I think from the standpoint of under-inclusivity, it's pretty significant that Tennessee now is completely overriding parents' wishes when they are best positioned to know their individual child and to have a good sense of whether the risks of this treatment are outweighed by the benefits.
But this isn't, I guess my point is, even if we decided that this wasn't a sex-based classification that triggered intermediate scrutiny, that would not prevent parents from still asserting the substantive due process right.
Yes, of course, I agree with that. I do think that the sex-based classification under Equal Protection Clause is the most straightforward way to think about what's going on here, though.
Yeah, thanks.
Justice Jackson?
So I'm glad that you've clarified that how we characterize this law is really the issue on the table today, not the risks or benefits or the policies that justify it, but how we characterize it. And I guess I think there might be some confusion a little bit, at least I'm confused, because there's so many lines that this statute could draw. The classification, as far as I can tell, is a line drawing, is the statute drawing lines, and there are lots of different ones. And Tennessee says this is drawing a line between people on the basis of age and purpose, and I totally see that. You say this is drawing a line on the basis of sex. I see that as well, but I guess my sort of initial question is, are those mutually exclusive? Do we have to choose between those characterizations? Isn't there a world in which this statute is doing both of those things? And the question for equal protection purposes is, if you're right that there is a sex-based line being drawn, then to the extent the plaintiffs are implicated by that line, don't we have to apply heightened scrutiny in evaluating their claims?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think, of course, you could say this is a statute that classifies based on age and purpose and sex. Critically, we think that purpose incorporates sex here because the purpose is expressly defined in terms of treatments that are inconsistent with sex.
Right.
So I think the problem with the state's approach is to say, well, it's just purpose going on. You take one look at that, and that just dissolves down into drawing a sex-based line itself.
Can we put more flesh on that, though? Because, I mean, even if we separate out their age and purpose, and we just say, okay, so how is this actually drawing a line on the basis of sex? I think I heard you say it a couple times with respect to some examples, but I think it would be helpful to get on the table exactly who's falling on what side of the line in a particular situation related to sex.
Yes, so the way that the sex-based classification is working here is that from the standpoint of any individual who wants to take these medications, their sex determines whether SB1 applies. John Doe, one of the plaintiffs, wants to take puberty blockers to undergo a typical male puberty, but SB1 says that because John's sex at birth was female, he can't have access to those medications. And if you change his sex, then the restriction under SB1 lifts and it changes the result. And my friends say, well, that also simultaneously changes the medical purpose of using these medications. We don't dispute that point, that it might also inherently change purpose when you're changing sex.
But it doesn't have to, right? I thought of an example in which we...
So I just want to add here. So the reason that Jackson sort of made that argument where she's like, why do we have to differentiate between sex and age? Can it be both? Is because, we talked about the difference between strict scrutiny and intermediate scrutiny. Well, there's even a lower level, which is a rational.
For age?
Yeah, it's called the rational basis test, I believe is what it's called. And
So that lowers it even further.
right, so because age, my understanding is that age is not a quote what's called a suspect class historically by the courts.
Right.
So that means it's significantly easier for states to make age-based discriminatory laws and policies.
Right.
And so that's why she was kind of making that argument. So, and I from a legal perspective, I mean, I don't know. It's weird because she's kind of making an intersectional argument. It's age and sex, but from legal argument, it seems like it's hard for me to see the logic of them kind of weaseling out of, or arguing out of, I should be more neutral, arguing out of sort of it's just an age restricted policy. So
Right. Age is the appropriate factor here. It really is.
Super Cross, thanks so much for $20. Says scrutiny means how broad the government's ability is to pass a law. Low scrutiny means the government can essentially do what it wants. Strict scrutiny means the government can only do this manner if no lesser means is available. Right. So I guess yes. So age would be a low scrutiny, while gender is like the medium scrutiny and race is the high scrutiny. So
have a plaintiff, a person a minor, who would like to take this medication to affirm their gender as a male because the medication deepens their voice, for example. They want a deeper voice.
Oh my God,
they're
throwing
biologically
shade.
male.
Oof.
They're taking the medication because that's what they want. They, I think, can get that medication.
That's right. And
But
so
a person who is biologically female who wants to take the medication for that same purpose, to deepen their voice because they would like to live as a male.
wait a minute. Are you saying this whole time I could have taken testosterone to deepen my voice? Son of a bitch. Adam, what the fuck?
Look, I'm not sure.
I messed up, man.
I think taking testosterone could be bad for you. I don't know that you can just add more testosterone. I think the system that your body has is calibrated for a certain amount of testosterone or estrogen.
I'm
So you could get other
assuming
factors.
I'm assuming you could only do this when you are going through puberty. I don't think you just take testosterone at any point in time and start getting a deeper voice.
Right.
But I guess I don't know. Maybe that's what the trans people are doing. I have no clue. I messed up. I messed out.
The unintended
missed out.
consequences
The
could be horrible.
the sad life of having a cartoon voice like PSI Sitch.
I mean, it's not so bad. What do you?
It's pretty bad.
Jeez.
I got
I mean,
gypped
some people
literally.
sound like Mickey Mouse.
I know. Well, I got gypped because it's funny because both my dad and my brother have like very deep voices,
Oh, very.
and I got the nasally
Deep.
voice. Yes, I got screwed.
Well, stop talking through your nose.
I can't help it.
As a male, can't get it. Male can't get it. Is that
that's
right?
correct. And
All
that
right,
is
so
on the basis of their sex.
So the purpose is held constant with that example. It's not changing. What is changing is just the biological sex of the individual.
I think that that's correct. But even in a circumstance where you might characterize that as treating delayed puberty instead of gender dysphoria, if you said, well, there is a different purpose there, even though the effects are exactly the same and they want the medications for exactly the same reason, that doesn't eliminate the sex-based classification because sex only has. And I think the state will say it's perfectly reasonable to treat different medical purposes or uses differently. We don't disagree, but that's something that's channeled to the application of heightened scrutiny. And if the state has a really good reason to say, there's a danger in using these drugs if your birth sex was female and you want to deepen your voice.
Right.
It's different.
So that's Justice Alito's studies and all of this.
Exactly. That all goes to the application of heightened scrutiny, and maybe the state can prove it up and show they have an important state interest and they really have a reason to distinguish between who can have these drugs for which purposes based on their sex. But that doesn't eliminate the facial sex classification or provide a reason for this court to turn its back on 50 years of precedent saying if you classify based on sex, you have to justify that.
And it's interesting to me that you mentioned precedent, because some of these questions about sort of who decides and the concerns and legislative prerogatives, et cetera, sound very familiar to me. They sound in the same kinds of arguments that were made back in the day 50s, 60s with respect to racial classifications and inconsistencies. I'm thinking in particular about loving, and I'm wondering whether you've thought about the parallels, because I see one, as to how this statute operates and how the anti-miscegenation statutes in Virginia operated.
Yes, and I think the court has recognized that the Equal Protection Clause was intended to force some changes in society and get us to think more closely about the way that people were being classified, including when that was based on overbroad generalizations of how we expect them to live and order their affairs. And the court has made that clear in the sex discrimination cases as well, where it said sometimes these laws operate to disadvantage someone who falls outside the average description, and that person needs the protection of the court.
Well, and I think I thought what was most interesting about the potential comparison to loving is that in that case, everyone seemed to concede up front that a racial classification was being drawn by the statute. That was sort of like the starting point. The question was whether it was...
I fucking hate this argumentation.
Mm-hmm.
Just because the sex classification and the race classification are so different. I just can't abide by this.
Discriminatory because it applied to both races and it wasn't, necessarily invidious or whatever. But, as I read the statute here, the case here, the court starts off by saying that Virginia is now one of 16 states which prohibit and punish marriages on the basis of racial classifications. And when you look at the structure of that law, it looks in terms of, you can't do something that is inconsistent with your own characteristics. It's sort of the same thing. So it's interesting to me that we now have this different argument, and I wonder whether Virginia could have gotten away with what they did here by just making a classification argument the way that Tennessee is in this case.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, that there is absolutely a parallel between any law that says you can't act inconsistent with a protected characteristic, and in all other contexts, the court has recognized that as a facial classification based on that characteristic, and Tennessee even concedes the point when it comes to dress codes and to seeking a profession inconsistent with sex. But I think one other way to look at this, Justice Jackson, is that, to me, it would be a remarkable proposition for this court to say that a statute that on its face says you can't have medications inconsistent with your sex, and in part that's because we want you to appreciate your sex, isn't drawing a sex-based line in the first place. That would have no correspondence to or grounding in the text of the statute or how it works in operation or what effects it produces for individuals on the ground.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel.
Who's next?
The defense, I assume, the state.
Mr. Strangio?
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. On its face, SB 1 bans medical care only when it is inconsistent.
Oh, wait a minute. I don't know who was talking the whole time then, because they said this is Strangio.
Oh, okay.
We were wrong.
It sounds like another woman though.
I know, but not as high as the other voice.
Okay.
Consistent with a person's birth sex. An adolescent can receive medical treatment to live and identify as a boy if his birth sex is male but not female. And an adolescent can receive medical treatment to live and identify as a girl if her birth sex is female but not male. Tennessee claims this sex-based line drawing is justified to protect children. But SB 1 has taken away the only treatment that relieved years of suffering for each of the adolescent plaintiffs. And critically, Tennessee's arguments that SB 1 is sex neutral would apply if the state banned this care for adults too. By banning treatment only when it allows an adolescent to live, identify, or appear inconsistent with their birth sex, SB 1 warrants heightened scrutiny under decades of precedent. Because the Sixth Circuit failed to apply that standard, this court should vacate and remand. I welcome the court's questions.
If you are successful, what would your remedy be?
Your Honor, if we're successful here, the remedy would be to enjoin the state of Tennessee defendants from enforcing SB 1 as applied to our individual plaintiffs.
So in practical terms, what would it be? What would you get? Wouldn't you get you would get different treatment based on sex?
In practical terms, what it would mean is that an individual like John Doe, who was receiving medical treatment to undergo a typical male puberty prior to SB1 and is now barred from doing so because his birth sex is female, could then receive that treatment as he had been doing with the consent of his parents. So his sex would no longer be the basis for the denial of the medical care that his doctors recommended and his parents consented to.
Counsel, is there any significant respect in which your position departs from that of the Solicitor General?
No, Your Honor. The only argument that we make before the court here that the Solicitor General has not advanced is that this is a law that fails under any standard of review, that it is so discontinuous with the asserted interest in protecting children and therefore fails under any standard. But we think, as the Solicitor General made clear in her remarks, that it is clearly a sex classification on its face and should be resolved on that basis and remanded for the Sixth Circuit to apply that standard in the first instance.
Is there anything you would like to add, and maybe there isn't, but with respect to the Solicitor General's responses to my concern that this is unlike a case like Craig versus Bourne, unlike a case like Morales, and those where it was quite clearly simply stereotyping with respect, can men have the same rights as women with respect to adoption and the liquor laws. This does strike me, whatever you think about the disagreements between where Europe was some years ago and where Europe is now, where Europe is, where the United States is, in that it is quite a distinct type of inquiry that involves medical expertise, predictive judgments in the medical area than in those cases?
I don't dispute, Mr. Chief Justice, that at the application of heightened scrutiny, there will be particular considerations that involve the underlying medical evidence, as there always is. But I don't think that it would break new ground to apply heightened scrutiny here. The purpose of applying heightened scrutiny has been because, in part, we don't know at the outset whether a classification is benign, and many justifications for sex-based differential treatment in law were defended on the ground of biological differences and were upheld by the court under rational basis. And the role of heightened scrutiny is not to make sex a proscribed classification. It is just to shift the burden to the state to show their work and show that, in fact, this is a law that substantially advances an important governmental interest.
Thank you.
Counselor, are there other situations, the Chief Justice's question?
I mean, protecting children is a pretty important governmental interest. I don't see why they can't do that.
And just made me think of this, in which any of our levels of heightened scrutiny, whether they be intermediate or strict, require courts to make the judgment, the means ends calculation in this kind of medical context. Because I agree with you. I mean, I can see your point, like, well, as a matter of logic, we should shift this to that stage, assuming that the suspect class is triggered and we say this is sex classification. But is there any other situation in which courts get into that in the tiers of scrutiny? I mean,
so I would point, Your Honor, to recent cases involving the COVID-19 pandemic, in which many cases came up before this court, in which the states were regulating, undeniably in areas of public health and evolving science, and the court repeatedly made clear that, yes, of course, the states have latitude through their police power to regulate, but when they do so in ways that classifies based on suspect lines or infringes constitutional rights, then heightened scrutiny remains the standard that the courts apply to ensure that the state is advancing an important governmental interest.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of some. Can I just
Sure.
last follow-up? But even in those COVID-19 cases, courts weren't, and we certainly weren't, diving deep into the medical evidence and comparing Europe and America and looking at research. I mean, this would be, I think, of a different order. Do you agree?
I don't agree, Justice Barrett, in the sense that I do think it is precisely the role of the courts to assess the tailoring and look at the evidence, whether it's presented through expert testimony or not. It is not the role of the court necessarily to say definitively these risks outweigh these benefits or vice versa, but do what the district court did here, which is to look at the assertions of harm, make comparisons to how Tennessee treated all other medical care, and then see whether or not Tennessee had met its burden under heightened scrutiny. That type of tailoring inquiry, I believe, is precisely the role of the court.
Counsel, in the COVID, I have a colleague to my right.
This is why you just need to put some teeth into the remedy for the detransitioners and just say, look, you can do it, but if you cause more harm, then that harm is going to come back to bite you legally in the future.
Well, yeah, that'd be a lot more difficult to go against legally. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Whom I think very highly of, who spoke about the need of the courts to look at that evidence to ensure that there wasn't suppression of religion, correct?
That's correct, Justice Sotomayor.
Now, with respect to Justice Barrett's question on COVID, in my mind, it's a little more similar to the bathroom situation, because there, COVID was a risk not just to the individual and the threat to their own life, but their contact with others could threaten others. So the compelling state interest was different than just a pure medical issue, correct?
That's correct. I totally agree. The state interest was different.
All right. With respect to treating that issue, you can hear from some of my colleagues that they're worried that, and there is a plethora of science in this area, both that developed in Europe, and the lower court hasn't really looked at it. No one has. That courts are ill-suited to that. Why do you think they're not? What about the fundamental role of the court makes us suited to answer those questions?
Well, I think first, Justice Sotomayor, the role of the court is to ensure that when the government draws lines based on suspect classifications, that the states are tested to ensure that they're substantially advancing an important governmental interest. And when it concerns underlying questions of medicine or science, the judges and judges in the lower courts have every ability to assess the testimony before them, as the district court did here. This is not an area where I believe Tennessee is saying that medicine is altogether an area in which suspect classifications have no bearing on the judicial inquiry. It is precisely the role of the court to ensure that the government of Tennessee has substantially advanced an important governmental interest.
I have one small question to finish with. The regret issue that was raised to the Solicitor General. Respondents cite a figure of 85% of children expressing gender dysphoria regret later. You use a figure of 1% of minors who receive this treatment expressing regret. Can you tell me where those figures lie and exactly what the difference is between that 1% of children who receive these treatments expressing regret and the 85%?
Certainly, Justice Sotomayor. And so the first point I would say about the 85%, and we addressed this on page 22 of our reply brief, that's a misleading figure for two reasons. I think most critically, it refers to older studies of prepubertal children. And everyone here agrees that the medications that are banned by SB 1 are only prescribed to individuals after the onset of puberty. And so in JA 151 to 153, the evidence shows that once an adolescent reaches the onset of puberty, their likelihood to ultimately desist and identify with their birth sex is very low. And then as to the question of the 1%, the question of regret, which is a different question than what happens with prepubertal children, the record shows there that the rate of regret when people receive this medication after the onset of puberty is as low as 1%, and that's in JA 131 to 133. And I think what's important here, and the Solicitor General mentioned this, is that is exponentially lower than the rates of regret of treatments that are expressly permitted by SB 1.
Thank you, Counsel.
Could we explore what intermediate scrutiny might look like in operation in assessing laws like Tennessee's? So the Solicitor General on page 48 of her brief lists a lot of things that she says, well, if Tennessee were really concerned about the health and welfare of these minors, it would have taken into account a variety of things. So one is waiting periods. Another is whether puberty blockers should be exempted. Another concerns things to make sure that the future of these minors is properly respected, even though they personally cannot make mature judgments about potentially irreversible procedures. So she mentions things like two-parent consent or counseling, readiness criteria, age recommendations, licensing, certification, or reporting requirements for physicians, and other guardrails which are not specified. So if intermediate scrutiny were the regime that would apply, would it not be the case that judges would have to decide whether a particular package containing this much of that and that much of the other thing is sufficient? Wouldn't this be endless litigation with the decision based on determinations by lay judges regarding complicated medical issues?
So if I could make 2 points in response, Justice Alito. In the first is going back to the Solicitor General's example of West Virginia, where West Virginia looked at the underlying science and instead of categorically banning this medical treatment, created pathways with guardrails for individuals to access medical care. There has been no litigation over West Virginia's law, and if there were in other contexts, the question would remain whether or not the state could make out the showing that this is being treated in such a substantially different way than other forms of medical care. I do think that judges are equipped to make those determinations as they do in many other contexts.
A lot of categorical statements have been made this morning in argument and in the briefs about medical questions that seem to me to be hotly disputed. And that's a bit distressing. One of them has to do with the risk of suicide. Do you maintain that the procedures and medications in question reduce the risk of suicide?
I do, Justice Alito, maintain that the medications in question reduce the risk of depression, anxiety, and suicidality, which are all indicators of potential suicide.
And do you think that's clearly established? Do you think there's reason for disagreement about that?
I do think it is clearly established in the science and in the record. I think, as with all underlying questions of looking at evidence, there can be disagreement. I don't dispute that. But here, and sort of going back to questions about the Cass review, for example, the Cass review only looked at studies up until 2022.
Well, I don't regard the Cass review as necessarily as the Bible or as something that's true in every respect. But on page 195 of the Cass report, it says, there is no evidence that gender affirmative treatments reduce suicide.
What I think that is referring to is there is no evidence in the studies that this treatment reduces completed suicide. And the reason for that is completed suicide, thankfully and admittedly, is rare, and we're talking about a very small population of individuals with studies that don't necessarily have completed suicides within them. However, there are multiple studies, long-term longitudinal studies, that do show that there is a reduction in suicidality, which I think is a positive outcome to this treatment.
Let me ask
what even is suicidality? Like, suicide attempts, I understand, is something
Suicide
we can-
ideation is like thoughts and feelings of wanting
Right.
to commit suicide.
Right.
So she's saying that
People
the Cass
reporting
report-
that they're suicidal.
right. So the Cass report was saying, she's claiming, I don't know if it's true, she's claiming that the Cass report only was talking about completed suicides. But
Right,
that the
yes.
treatment showed positive effect for people feeling like they wanted to commit suicide.
Right. Yeah. Which is just, I mean, that's hard. That's a hard metric to tally, I think. Obviously, suicide attempts, you can count them up and keep
Well, it's-
statistics on them.
Right. Well, it's self-reported at that point.
Yeah, totally.
A question about another issue that came up during Justice Kagan's questioning and Justice Barrett's questioning in particular, and that is whether transgender status should be regarded as a quasi-suspect classification. And Justice Barrett referred to one of the things that our cases have mentioned in explaining when something should be classified as a quasi-suspect classification, and that is a history of discrimination. Another one is immutability. Is transgender status immutable?
May I answer, Mr. Chief Justice?
Sure.
So I would say that under this court's consideration of that criteria, it is a distinguishing characteristic. Transgender people are characterized by having a gender identity that differs from their birth sex. That is distinguishing and discrete. And that also within the characterization, I would also point, if I could, to the history of discrimination, and there are many examples of in-law discrimination, exclusions from the military, criminal bans on cross-dressing, and others.
Thank you, counsel. I think I lost track of the discussion you were having about COVID. What was the point you were trying to make?
I think,
somebody was trying to make it.
Yes, I think it was me. And the point about COVID and the question of whether or not this court has ever considered applying heightened scrutiny to contexts in which states are grappling with evolving medical evidence. And I would point to Justice Gorsuch's statement in South Bay United Pentecostal, in which the purpose of heightened scrutiny, even when the government is grappling with experts of a medical character, is to still test whether or not that infringement on an individual right or that use of a suspect classification meets the heightened scrutiny standard. It is not exempt simply because it is in the context of public health or medicine.
Well, I don't want to relive the COVID cases.
You and me both, yeah.
But it does seem to me that one of the issues that came up, and as to which courts around the country had vastly different views, was the lack of knowledge about precisely what was going on, what the effects were going to be, what the remedies were going to be. If this is similar to that, I think that would be very troubling, to say that in such a evolving situation, we are going to decide what the right approaches are. I mean, you said at some point that the Tennessee court, or not the Tennessee court, this court is just as qualified as Tennessee to make the decisions here. And it's not really so much a question of qualifications. It's more questions of constitutional allegation of authority. And, we might think that we can do just as good a job with respect to the evidence here as Tennessee or anybody else. But my understanding is that the Constitution leaves that question to the people's representatives rather than to 9 people, none of whom is a doctor. Particularly and maybe I'm just repeating myself, but you can look, should we follow the United Kingdom position from 3 years ago? Should we follow the United Kingdom's position now? It seems to me that it is something where we are extraordinarily bereft of expertise.
Well,
anyway, just what you think.
Mr. Chief Justice, if I could first respond to the first half of your question about whether or not this is comparable in terms of the underlying science with respect to COVID-19, and I think absolutely it is not. I merely use that example to say that the court has not hesitated to suggest that heightened scrutiny applies in contexts that deal with medicine and science. And then with respect to what is the role of the courts, I continue to think it is to test whether or not a law is properly tailored, and that is what the district court did here. And in fact, the underlying science and the evidence showed that Tennessee's assertion of harm and their prevalence were not supported. The district court made factual findings to that effect, of which Tennessee has not argued were clearly erroneous. And so if what is left here is just bare rationality review, Tennessee is in essence saying, let's not look at the evidence at all, whether this is a law that bans this medical treatment for minors or for adults, that In all other contexts, what Tennessee does is recognize that there are risks and there are benefits. And usually the state regulates by informing patients of the risks and tailoring to minimize them. Here, what they've done is impose a blunderbuss ban, overriding the very careful judgment of parents who love and care for their children and the doctors who have recommended the treatment.
Thank you. Justice Thomas?
The point I was getting at with respect to remedies is normally in equal protection cases, there's a difference between one group and another. In Bourne, it would be that the women could buy alcohol, but the male students could not. And what would that be in this case?
So 2 points, Your Honor. I think that what the birth males can do that birth females cannot do is receive medical treatment to live and identify as boys, and what birth females can do that birth males can't do is receive medical treatment to live and identify as girls. That's
okay, let's change. What if, would you make the same argument if we were only talking about puberty blockers?
If it was puberty blockers, I would point to John Doe, who is receiving puberty blockers. The purpose of receiving puberty blockers for John Doe is so that in the future he can undergo a typical male puberty.
No, I'm talking about from an equal protection standpoint, the difference in treatment. Normally in these cases, one group receives something that the other group does not. And I'm trying to discern that in this case.
And so what I would say to Justice Thomas is that a birth sex male can receive puberty blockers to undergo a typical male puberty, and a birth sex female cannot. And if I could slow it down and just explain a little bit how that works. If you're someone who was born male and you are going through puberty too early, you want to be able to have a final adult height that is typical of boys. You may receive puberty blockers so that you can develop as a typical boy. Someone who has a sex of female at birth is also receiving puberty blockers so that they can undergo a puberty like other boys. And so it is the same purpose, and what makes the treatment prohibited for the birth sex female is their sex.
Justice Alito?
Counsel, I don't think you had a chance to finish answering my question, whether transgender.
How does this work in comparison to like legal medical marijuana laws? Like if you say, okay, you can take medical marijuana, but only if you're 21 or older, right? How is this not comparable to that?
Yeah, that's the same question I'm asking myself. And the thing that Justice Thomas keeps pointing to,
Because I know,
like
and there was
age discrimination.
I remember there was a case, I think this was in Colorado, where there was a young child who had severe epilepsy. And this was like the first time that someone was able to create, or not was able to, but actually bothered to, I guess, create a strain of marijuana that had like no THC in it. It was just CBD, because that was like the thing that I think was useful for controlling seizures. And this would work on this like very young child to prevent them from having seizures. And so I think if I recall correctly, they created a specific law that was allowing even underage people to take like specific strains of marijuana that had no THC in them for very specific medical purposes.
Right.
And it feels like this would all be somewhat analogous to any of these arguments.
Well, she's making a similar argument in that the purpose of the puberty blockers in a male is to make them taller, and she's just basically saying a biological female wants to take those puberty blockers
Right.
for the same reason, to develop male sex characteristics.
Right, but
Right.
that's because she wants to keep relating it back to a sex discriminatory purpose,
Right.
as opposed to an age discriminatory purpose.
Right.
So, which I mean, I
But
guess
the discrimination goes away, though. Obviously, the age discrimination goes away if it's the same drug that's being given to prepubescent boys to achieve height.
Right.
greater
Well, but
height.
that's and that's, I guess that is the problem,
Yeah.
that the state of Tennessee has to argue that.
Right. Yes.
Gender status is
The,
immutable. You cited a bunch of other.
How are you saying?
I just there's so many different ways that you can slice this. They're focusing in on the particular medical procedure, but the goal is to transition from male to female. So I mean, I don't see why they couldn't just say, in the same way that they say, you're not old enough to make a decision about a face tattoo, right? I don't see why they can't say a similar situation here where you're not old enough to make a decision on whether or not you want to transition from male to female.
Well, I guess because the problem is with a face tattoo, it's simple. It's like no one can get a face tattoo until there's some age. But this would be like, oh well, boys can get a blue face tattoo and girls can get a pink face tattoo. And you're
I
like,
mean,
well,
it's
why?
not that dissimilar though.
It's not, no, but that's the difference between that's why they're trying to make it. They're saying that you can't just regulate it purely to age because there's a sex discrimination element to it too.
Yeah, but a boy who's taking puberty blockers to be taller, a biological male that's taking puberty blockers to be taller is not engaging in transitioning. They're not getting the face tattoo.
I understand that, but that's not really
They're getting
relevant
more
to
like braces than a face tattoo, right?
right, but that wouldn't necessarily be relevant to just trying to determine which level of scrutiny the state should apply in the first place.
Right.
Like you could,
Well, I mean, it would in terms of the age discrimination thing.
well, no,
Because
because
you're discriminating based on age, and you're saying, look, you can't engage in this activity because you're too young.
right. Yes, but then you're saying, but young boys can engage in that activity. So now that makes it, now there's a gender level to it.
Well, that's why I made the distinction between the particulars of achieving the goal and the goal itself. Because, I mean, yes, they're taking the medication to achieve certain sex characteristics, but those are sex characteristics that are consistent with their biological sex. So they're not transitioning. They're not getting the face tattoo.
Right, but I don't think that would be a relevant argument on strictly the grounds of what level of scrutiny to apply. That would be a relevant argument to make once the level of scrutiny is found out about whether the state has a compelling interest, I guess, to limit it, even if it's a form of gender discrimination.
So they have to separate these into two arguments. Like they have to determine, is this an age thing or is this a sex thing, and then they can
Yes.
dial in on the specifics,
Yeah,
specific
because
behavioral stuff.
right, because if they were to determine that it was purely a sex thing, I'm sorry, if they determined it was purely an age thing, then the state would basically, I'm assuming, would automatically be able to make the law would automatically pass.
Yeah, because it's whatever. They
Right.
have a lot of leeway there.
Right.
With
But then if it
age.
was a sex thing, then you'd have additional scrutiny where maybe the law could pass, but it'd be more difficult. The argument would be far more difficult to make to the court.
Right.
So
It's gonna be an age thing. I'm convinced the conservatives have it locked down. All of their argumentation seems to aimed at the age discrimination.
it might be. I'm
argument.
curious as to what the exact argument they're gonna to levy for that is to sort of circumvent, that issue. That's kind of both.
Yeah. You want to read some super chats? And
Sure.
do you want to? There was, I guess we could look at it tomorrow. There was something about Tim Pool versus Cenk Uygur.
Yeah, it was a pretty short clip.
I saw
I guess we
something
can
going
cover it
around
tomorrow.
on YouTube that was not really. I mean, Cenk doesn't even really say anything in the clip, but I did see he was on Tim Pool again.
Yeah, I watched the whole thing. It wasn't super. I mean, I guess it was like a good conversation. I guess it was like a nice conversation. So, but it wasn't
that's
super
good.
interesting then. So, there was not the usual. I mean, Jank is being, probably more amenable than I've ever seen him be in a conversation. which is pretty interesting.
Wow.
Except for one part, there's this other guy. I don't know who this guy is. This other guy on a panel who's like super, like he obviously despises Cenk and is like really trying to, get his goat. So, but besides that, he seemed like he's pretty amenable.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah. MAGA Man for $20 says if state law prohibiting transitions for minors is unconstitutional due to sex discrimination, then wouldn't laws on tobacco and alcohol sales be unconstitutional due to age discrimination? What about Social Security? So no, because I'm assuming you said that after we talked about it. Because because it's states can discriminate on age at a far greater capacity than they can on sex, because age isn't a strict protected class the way sex is or gender. So,
Which is interesting.
right. Well, it makes sense. I mean, because you have to have laws that adjudicate, because we can't treat, children as adults. So,
Yeah, no, that's important, obviously.
Mr.
Gotta
Ricross
protect
for
the children.
right. Mr. Ricross for $10 says the biggest problem is that if sex is transitory rather than immutable, it should lose its protected status. Sex cannot be both modifiable and immutable.
Oh, that's
Well,
yeah, okay, I
that's
get it.
interesting. But wait, why would that be? Because isn't religion is a protected status, and that you can change your religion, right? So how does
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. I guess, is religion a protected status?
it is?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So is it just
She should
yeah,
just
I'm not
call
sure.
this a religion then and
Right.
gain all the protected status.
Mr. Ubercross said you can fire people for being old. Okay, so yeah, then definitely not a protected status. Right. So
Didn't we just do that? Didn't we have a presidential election that did that?
you're right. We did the country just did that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
We
that's
fired
true.
someone for being old.
That's a good point.
Take a hike.
Right.
Did we get all of these super chats already? No, we
No, we didn't. Mr. Request says generally not strict scrutiny. Wait, religion is not strict scrutiny? Really? I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah, I would think immutable is the line, but this is the thing. This is the fight. I have never been convinced that transgenderism is immutable. I've never been convinced of that. With homosexuality, it's very easy for me. And I often wonder how many people think that they're homosexual and then they experiment with homosexuality and just discover, oh, I'm not homosexual. So, but no harm, no foul, right? They just
it doesn't
move
matter,
on.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. But this is a much different situation. And I guess this is just me being completely in the rationalist, materialist, scientific way of thinking. I don't understand how, once you understand the biological sex differences, if you have all the sense apparatus that a biological male has or a biological female has, how is it not just some sort of internal desire to be the opposite sex? And then it's something closer to like vocation. Like some people decide, I want to be a doctor. Some people decide, I want to be an attorney, right? But we don't think of that as immutable, right?
Right.
Yeah. You're not at birth born to be a doctor or a firefighter or
Right.
an astronaut, right? These are decisions that we make. And more power to you. Like we shouldn't have a society that discriminates against transgender people. But I think it's a form of identity creation that's it's far more different than, and I know everyone always makes the analogy to homosexuality, but I just think homosexuality is categorically different because then we're talking about it's funny that people change it to orientation from preference, because preference does seem more just like something you can change, right?
Right.
But I don't necessarily know if you can. Like I
Can you change your preferences? I mean,
Well, you can. I mean, you can develop a taste for certain things, right? But
mm-hmm.
I love Newcastle beer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my dad's favorite beer is Newcastle. It makes me think, I wonder what's going on there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So it just, yeah, yeah, I don't, and so look, if people want to transition as adults, they want to live their lives as men or women, I think that's something society can deal with. But when it comes to children, the entire purpose of childhood is to kind of experiment with your identity in a kind of a vocational way, right? Am I going to be a doctor? Am I going to be a firefighter? What am I going to do? How am I going to join society and engage with society? I think there's a lot of experimentation that takes place. And if we have an entire apparatus that steps in, when you're experimenting and says, oh, you're immutably a doctor, or oh, you're immutably an artist, you're kind of locking someone into a life path that, may not be good for them. Maybe they go to college and they discover, oh, hell, I don't want to be a doctor.
Right.
I want to do something completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's generally why we have, different laws for children and adults. So
Yes, of course. So this is the way I think about it. And I know this could be perceived as offensive to some people who do think transgenderism is immutable. I mean, what is your take on that? Do you think it's immutable?
I think for people that actually have gender dysphoria, it's probably immutable.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't. The problem is, it's so difficult to make the determination.
Right.
Not only who has it, but even why it even exists. Like if we had a clear understanding of like why it even existed in the first place in like the brain, then I think we'd be on much more solid ground. But we really don't.
Right.
That's part of the issue.
Yeah. So separating it out. Look, if you think of it as and this is sometimes offensive too, if you think of it as a mental illness, right? Obviously, someone who has schizophrenia or something like that, you'd think,
Right.
well, that's immutable, right?
Yes.
They can't change that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, I mean, it is a mental illness, but in the context of like it's probably a brain developmental issue. Something is something the brain developed in a specific way that causes it.
Right.
So just the way that people are born and they can have ADD or I guess usually it's not necessarily that people are like necessarily born. People are like born with like generally the capacity to have something, and then something triggers it, either like environmentally, genetically, whatever. Sometimes things can just get set off. So, Mr. Ubercross said, religion is normally intermediate scrutiny, but if the law is tailored to a specific religion, then it can be strict scrutiny. Oh, okay. And then I found something else that says, for several decades, beginning in the 1960s, the United States Supreme Court applied a strict scrutiny test in all free exercise cases. Strict scrutiny requires that a burden on religious exercise must be outweighed by a compelling interest and narrowly tailored. However, in 1990, in the Employment Division versus Smith, the court held that strict scrutiny does not apply to government actions that are neutral and generally applied. Under Smith, federal courts upheld such general applied government actions as long as they only have an incidental effect on religious practice. For other types of government actions, the burden of free exercise of religion, strict scrutiny continues to apply. Okay, so that lines up exactly with what Mr. Ubercross said. So, I mean, but that would still put, even if that was the case, that would still put it in the realm of intermediate scrutiny, where obviously the state of Tennessee wants to have it be, relegated to the lowest level of scrutiny.
Are these general legal terms, or are they just specific to the Supreme Court when you're talking about interpreting the Constitution?
Well, I think they're into the federal law.
Right.
I guess. So.
Right.
So, I mean, they're legal terms, yeah. But. Okay. I'm going to listen to the rest of this tomorrow.
Oh, I'm going to
because I'm curious to hear. I mean, I'm listening to the rest of this today because I'm curious to hear what the. Well, I don't know. Is this just the oral arguments for the?
They might They might have
on
the
the
oral
side.
arguments for the other side tomorrow.
Okay, because
if
I'm
they
curious
just,
what their
sometimes they
argument,
do
counter
that.
arguments are. So
I listened to the whole case that overturned gay marriage, and I think it was like 10 hours long or something.
right,
So
right, right.
they must have done it over multiple days.
Let's see. Where did
It
I?
is fascinating, isn't it?
It is very interesting. Yeah.
This
And
is just all the assigned at birth stuff. Oh man, that has to be worked out legally. That does have to be worked out legally.
yeah, yeah. But that's I mean, that's going to be under a different issue than this. I mean, if the court upholds this Tennessee law, which I think they most likely will, you will probably see a lot more red states adopt these policies, I would imagine.
Of course, yeah.
So, yeah, there'll be a bunch, and then you'll have a lot of news of people saying, thank you, Donald Trump, and then they'll be like, this is what you get for not helping vote for Harris. Conversation will start up again. So,
This has to be terrifying as a parent.
right.
It has to be terrifying. Because your kids, your kids are experimenting with different identities, and this is like the identity you're like, oh please, oh please, oh please, don't.
Mm-hmm.
Like if your kid turn, and I hate that they compare it to the gay thing, because if your kid turns out to be gay, like that's not a life of medical surgeries and whatnot.
Right, right,
Yeah. Who cares? A lot of people don't care now. They just don't care.
right.
This is a completely different situation.
That's true. Junior Penguin for $5 says the medical I read that one. 42nd.
I think we're after Eric. Adam, you have no idea what it is to be cold. I think
Oh,
that's
okay,
what
you're
we're
right.
at.
Yeah. Naxos for $5. Thank you. Says the etiology. I'm unfamiliar with that word.
Yeah.
Etiology. The cause, set, or causes a manner of causation of a disease or condition. Oh, okay. The etiology is sex different. For girls, it's mostly social contagion and fear of male attention. For boys, it's their sexuality doesn't change. Well,
That
I mean,
makes sense. Yeah.
well, I understand that girls are more susceptible to social contagion, but even so, there still seems to be a higher propensity of boys who I believe are getting hit with the false positive. I think it's a lot more girls than boys, but I still think there's a higher number of boys getting hit with the false positive than before. So that's why I wouldn't make the distinction that you're making. Righteous Indifference for 19 months says, could parents not having the right to trans their kids measure against Florida saying parents have a right to be informed of a child transitioning? I don't know what the exact legal logic was given for parental rights in that regard, so I can't answer that question. I would guess not offhanded. But that's just my intuition. An Access for $5 says failure to treat this issue as one for female to male and the other for male to females is medical misconduct. It's like comparing cervical cancer to prostate cancer. Well, I mean, again, I understand that there is a difference. I mean, there obviously has to be a difference in the mechanism because pre all the gender stuff, there was a vastly different rate. I think it was something like 0.003% for girls and 0.014% for boys, which means it was much higher in boys than in girls. So there's obviously some biological difference there, but it still exists in both of them. So you still need to find the magic brain scan to make the determination.
And the age when they become interested in transitioning for males, like the male autogonophile is later in life. Like they describe it as like 30s to 40s.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if there was just like a big increase in just girls and the numbers for boys was exactly the same, then I would be inclined to agree with you next, but that's not my understanding of the literature.
It's funny that they call it social contagion with girls, but boys, it's peer pressure. I mean, it's like
right. That's
physical pressure. Yeah.
Right.
Because we got plenty of that. I'm sure you got plenty of it when you were a kid, Sitch, right?
Sure, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's usually like not like it's implicit. It's usually an implicit form of peer pressure.
Right.
Like it's not like, I mean, I never had in my experience, I never had like in the movies where it's like, oh, if you don't do this, you're not cool. Like I've never had someone like directly say that, but it was kind of like implicit in the conversation.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. I mean, they people do that all the time still, and it's so retarded.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a typical debate bro tactic. Oh my God, you're a coward. Fucking yeah. Look, that kind of
Yeah,
peer
no, I
pressure
guess
happens
that's
all the
no
time.
right. But to
Still,
me, when
it's
when someone says
ridiculous.
like if you don't do something, you're a coward, to me, as I said, that's still implicit. They're not saying you're not cool, but being a coward is like not being
Is
cool.
uncool. Okay, I
Yeah,
guess.
that's what.
Yeah,
So I mean, I guess maybe you wouldn't call it implicit, but
right. People are always trying to manipulate, but it is such a male tactic. Like females just don't do that.
well, but
Anyway.
I think they do in terms of like, oh, you're ugly, you're a slut, you're a
Mhm.
femcel. Like this, just it just kind of shows itself in just a different way, you know.
Right.
TL1524 for $5 says, guys, as a healthcare provider who specializes in PEDS, this entire conversation and case is making me want to spurt out harder than Destiny on stream.
Yeah.
Well, but in what direction? That's the question. In which direction?
Angry, I'm certain.
No, but yeah, okay.
Yeah. Being upset about it.
Boba Peck for 28 months. Thanks so much. Being a free will seeker for 28 months says, Adam was listening to you guys talk about intention of lying yesterday. Isn't consistent delusional disinformation what you call systemic lying? That is what we call systemic lying. Yeah.
Consistent delusional misinformation. Yeah, that is what we call systemic lying. Yeah.
So I guess we should just circumvent our argument and say that Trump is a systemic liar. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking more about the Hunter Biden situation yesterday, and people were pointing out in the comments that which I mean, I admire what you're doing. You're basically saying we can't get into this situation or we just ignore the faults on our side and only monomaniacally focus on the faults on the other side. That's why you're bringing up, Trump has done a bunch of sketchy pardons too, right? This is in the context of Joe Biden pardoning Hunter Biden. But I do think it's important to make the distinction that all of the sketchy pardons that Trump has done were not like familia related. Like, and if Trump did pardon his sons, I think it would be like a next level type of event. So,
well, number one, I mean, I kind of agree with you, but also pardoning your son's father or son-in-law's father is pretty close, right?
yeah.
So that's it. But number two, I think I only said in the beginning, like the 90% of the time in that conversation when I was bringing up Trump pardoning people, it had nothing to do with saying that we need to look at both sides equally. It was because people kept saying an argument, which I thought completely has no ground, where they say, well, just because someone is pardoned, they're automatically guilty.
Right.
Or they should be perceived as automatically guilty. And I was like, well, how can you say that only in relating to Hunter Biden? Are you also going to say that in relating to everyone Trump's pardoned? Because most people are not saying that. So that's why I was bringing that up. I wasn't bringing that up to say that we need, I'm saying you have to be consistent in your approach of saying that being pardoned automatically means you're guilty.
Right.
So,
well, I think Steve Bannon, didn't Steve Bannon get a pardon, but still ended up in jail?
Yeah, but I think I don't know what he was pardoned for. He went to jail for contempt of Congress. I don't know what the pardon was for.
Right.
I think because he went to jail when Biden was president. So he was pardoned for something different or before the contempt of Congress charge.
I believe it was for the GoFunding campaign for building the wall. That ended
right.
up netting
That
like
he totally
billions
scammed
of
people.
dollars.
Yeah,
Yeah,
see?
exactly.
Right. But I mean, how is that not, yeah, he's not a family member, but like, how is that not equally as scammy? You literally had Steve Bannon,
I don't think he got pardoned
Trump.
for that. I think that's what he went to jail for. Yeah.
No. Wait, no,
Yeah, I think that's what he went to jail for.
Pardon me, hold on.
Because they wanted to. Oh, okay. Maybe you're right. Maybe that's what they wanted to drag him into Congress and question him about. Maybe he did get pardoned for it.
I don't remember exactly what Steve Bannon got pardoned for, so I just want to make sure. Because if it was for that build the wall thing, that's like crazy.
Yeah.
Steve Bannon, in the final hours White House term as a part of a flurry of clemency actions that benefited more than 140 people. Steve Bannon is getting pardoned from Trump after defrauding Trump's own supporters into paying for a wall.
So
Yes,
it
it
was
was
for
for
the
the
go.
wall thing. Yeah.
Okay. So he got pardoned for the build the wall thing, and then they wanted to drag him into Congress. He didn't go into Congress.
Well, I think they wanted to
and-
drag him into Congress for a completely unrelated. It had nothing to do with that. I think it was about the documents or January 6th or something. I don't think it had anything to do with the build the wall thing.
So but that's why he got thrown in jail, contempt of Congress.
Yes,
he didn't
because
go
he
in.
didn't show up.
Okay. Yeah, the build a wall thing, pretty scammy. I mean, if you're talking about Kamala Harris taking $1 billion and giving it, $1 million to Oprah and all these celebrities, that's obviously very shady, right? Unethical to take money from $20 donations from your supporters and give it to fabulously rich celebrities. This is not dissimilar from that, is it? The build the wall situation.
Right.
You're taking small dollar donations from people who probably could use that money somewhere else.
Well, so yeah, so what it was the We Build the Wall was an organization that got donations to build private sections of the wall along the Mexico-U.S. border. Started as a GoFundMe, then it became a nonprofit. Let's see, it raised over $25 million. But what happened to the money, I guess is the question.
But anyway.
Because it turned out that it was like not being used. Let's see. It says one of the people took $350,000 for personal use. Steve Bannon took over $1 million to cover personal expenses while concealing their use of donor funds by creating sham invoices and accounts to launder donations and cover up their crimes. Interesting.
Wow.
According to the courts, anyway. That's what the court said. So, anyways.
Right.
So yeah, pretty scammy thing to give Bannon a pardon for that, but
right.
Okay.
The thing about the Hunter situation, though, is just the familia situation and being involved in the family business and that kind of thing. So.
Well, I think that there's another element, which is that people perceive the Hunter Biden pardon is also to protect Joe Biden
himself. Exactly. Right. Yeah, that's the point I'm making.
Right. Which obviously the build a wall thing doesn't protect Trump, but which could be true if two things were true. If the Burisma accusations were true, and if by doing this, it would somehow prevent investigations into that, which I think it might only prevent FBI investigations. It wouldn't prevent congressional investigations, which there has been numerous of already, and they have discovered absolutely fucking nothing. So good luck. Ryan Uhl for $10 says, I feel like not caring isn't enough for far leftists. You have to be 100% supportive of the cause. Otherwise, you're a bigot to them. Besides that, Sitch, you should check out Mouthwashing. Very good. What is Mouthwashing?
Did you read all
video
these?
game Mouthwashing. Okay, I'll check it out.
I don't know. I have no idea where you're reading from, but anyway.
Oh, I somehow my thing skipped ahead. Let me go back. I don't know why I did that.
Here in Oh no, we already read that one.
Where were we?
We are at
Bernard Zorro's here, or we're in Naxos.
Naxos for
$5 says being trans is a medical treatment, not a priori identity. No one is born trans. People become trans because they have dysphoria, usually from AGP.
Yeah, there you go. Look, that's my conceptualization of it exactly, right there.
No. Wait. Hold on. You're totally mixing up terms. Okay. Transitioning is a medical treatment. Being transgender is a condition or is a state of being. Okay. Now, if you're saying that, well, okay. Now you can make an argument.
It's like being a cancer survivor, though. That's not an
right.
identity.
Right. But you can make the argument. You can make a distinction where you say having gender dysphoria is a priori, or being transgender is not. I guess. I'd have to think about that. I guess I'm not sure how relevant it would be to any of the points I'm making or the broader conversation, but
It is relevant in whether or not it's a protected class. Would you make cancer survivor a protected class?
I mean, maybe if there was some weird
Discrimination against cancer
discrimination
survivors?
against cancer, like if a bunch of people thought cancer survivors were like witches that had to be like stoned or
Well,
something,
okay.
like
Bring out the protected class.
well, that's because like a lot of the protected classes, they exist because there was a reason to protect them. Like we didn't have a reason. Like you're born, like height is an immutable characteristic, right? You're not born the height you're going to be, but you're born with like the capacity for the height you're going to be generally. But that's not really a protected class because no one cared to do so, right? Or eye color, hair color. Like we just don't really have reasons to make these protected classes, but they could be if there was some discriminatory purpose, I guess, against them. So.
Mm-hmm.
So,
People
Bruno
want
Zero's
that
here for
protected
$10 says,
stance.
I don't understand the discrimination based on sex argument because it seems to be treating the sexes as blank slates. Benjamin Boyce is a guest on recently that was referencing this case, by the way. No, it doesn't treat, it doesn't treat the sexes as blank slates. It's basically just saying that the sexes should have equal access or equal rights. It's not saying that they had to be treated as blank slates. I wouldn't say that. I understand how you like can come to that conclusion, but I don't think that's accurate.
Separate but equal, right?
Well, that's the bathrooms or separate vehicle, right? So
Yeah, look, the sexes have always been treated separate but equal.
to an extent. Well, not always been treated equal, but
Yeah.
Nolan Gomes for $10 says Peter Boghossian shared an interview with a surgeon at Texas Children's Transgender Clinic. It's unsettling and questions if doctors prioritize kids' well-being or creating lifelong patients. A-team.
Yeah, that's a scary thing. It really is. Whenever I watch one of these interviews with someone who was at the clinic, oh, read that Time to Think, the book on the Tavistock Clinic. That book will freak you the fuck out. It's so crazy because so many people in there, like they're diehard liberals, bleeding heart liberals, right? They're in there thinking they're helping people. And a lot of times they're looking around at each other going, are we really helping people?
Right.
Like they would joke around about how, they're basically just transing away the gay.
Mm-hmm.
They thought many people in the clinic were there just that they were just homosexual.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he uploaded a clip recently. The full interview he has it on his channel, Peter Boghossian's channel, Courageous Truth, meeting Dr. Ethan with an I, Eithan Ham, or Hyam, Haim. So
Dump it in the chat. Put it in the chat. Everyone can check it out.
I guess I could just do that.
You're there already.
I guess I could.
And then I can just click on it. I don't have to look it up.
That's the real reason. You just want
I know. I'm lazy. Come on.
Right.
It's cold. I'm freezing. I just want to sit in bed with my phone. Sitch.
Let's see,
Have some mercy on your friend.
Mr. Millman for 2 hours says, have you guys seen the CEO got taken out by a hitman? I saw that there's a CEO who was the head of some private healthcare that got killed. Was it a hitman? I don't know anything about why or the killer or whatever, but.
That's scary. That's fucking scary.
Ryan Thompson, CEO of United Healthcare, fatally shot outside of New York hotel, described as a brazen attack. Oh, it's on video. Okay. Let's see. He's walking down the street on his own business. Oh my God.
Don't bring it up. I was going to say.
No, so he's walking down this. So I guess it does. That's why people are saying it's like a hitman. So he's walking down the street just randomly. A guy comes up behind him. It looks like a young kid almost. Like looks like a little skinny white kid in like a all black hoodie, and he pulls out like a gun that looks like it's got a silencer on it, like it's in a movie. He just fucking shoots him in the back.
Wow.
So pretty crazy.
Yeah, I wonder if it's he's the CEO of what company?
Of United Healthcare.
United Healthcare. It's probably some situation where the health insurance denied his family member treatment or something like
You know what's
that.
funny? My mom literally said the same thing to me.
Just now?
Yeah, what she was telling me about it earlier.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
She was
look, it's
like,
got
"Oh
to
yeah,
be.
it's probably someone who's denied healthcare."
Like,
I was
who
like,
hasn't been in a healthcare situation and been like, I want to fucking murder someone over this shit?
right. Maybe.
That's exactly where the mind goes pretty easily. You're like, this someone needs to pay.
Right.
The scales of justice are out of whack.
Naxos Friday says you cannot understand. I'll read them together. Hold on.
Oh, you're jumping around again.
No, I'm not jumping
Oh,
around.
I guess we've already read these.
Naxos for $10 says you cannot understand trans issues without understanding what autogynephilia is and how it works, and all these conversations ever bring it up. We
I
do
bring it
understand
up
how
all the
trans
time.
work.
What are you talking
I know.
about?
We don't
I just
understand
brought
how
up
it works.
AGP.
It's a sexuality in males based on attraction to women being introverted into the self. It's been known for decades. Listen, Max, I don't know why you're like hyper fixated on this issue. I don't agree. This is okay. AGP is a theory. You cannot say that this is a definitive fact. You are incorrect. It is not a definitive fact. It is a theory. Maybe we'll do more study and all the theories and all the ideas about AGP will be 100% proven. That is not true. That is not the case. We do not know that, okay, with 100% certainty. We do know, or it seems to be, that there's strong evidence that there's something biological in people that makes them have gender dysphoria. And it does affect men and women differently, okay? I'm
But
not going to throw my hands up and just say AGP for everything. That's the magic answer that solves the question. It doesn't solve the question. We still need some biological way, like a brain scan, to determine who has gender dysphoria, whether they have AGP or not. All right. I don't know why like this is such a fixation.
But wait a second here. You know, so we both accept that there's AGP and gender dysphoria, and they're two separate things that
AGP can
exist in men.
cause, well, okay. AGP can cause gender dysphoria. But people can have gender dysphoria without AGP, and people can have AGP supposedly without gender dysphoria.
Right. Yes.
Right.
And who's the guy that did all the studies on this? Can't remember. I
Uh,
always forget his name.
I forget the guy's name too.
But I've read his book as well. And he's proudly featured in Galileo's Middle Finger, which is all about transgenderism and is a freaky book. If you ever want to read a good book, it has a lot about intersex people and stuff like that.
Blanchard.
Ray
Yeah.
Blanchard. That's
Right.
it. Yeah. So Ray Blanchard was targeted by the activist community, the trans activist community, but he had done a bunch of research on AGP and was one of the pioneers in distinguishing gender dysphoria from AGP. So,
Right.
look, and we talk about this all the time. Just like,
Right. And me and Adam have argued about this like pretty extensively on the AGP topic, because my position is that I'm not even sure whether I think adults that have AGP without gender dysphoria should even be allowed to transition.
right.
So
And
I'm
my
not even
position
100% on that.
And my position is I believe that Sitch has AGP. And
There
that's
you
why
go.
he freaks out so much when you guys talk about spending massive amounts of money to put him in a dress. Because
Right.
he's like, no, I've been fighting this my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
That's a joke, guys. Okay. That's not true.
Okay.
That's what you call peer pressure, subtle peer pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Senshi for $10.
Says isn't sexual orientation being immutable and compatible with blank slate? It always feels weird that we socially engineer all of our people, including gender, but not this. You are 100% correct, but that contradiction is never addressed by people that make those arguments. So,
Yeah, it is. It's a complete contradiction. It's like, oh, some people do try, right? That's where the whole idea of the conversion therapy comes from.
mm-hmm.
But basically, transitioning is a different type of conversion therapy. Some would argue a much more extreme type of conversion therapy. You're like, I'm going to convert the body, not the mind.
Right.
So read that
Naxos-
book, A Time to Think. It will freak you the fuck out. There's this one kid that is so clearly autistic. I mean, far, far down the autism spectrum. And they're like, yeah, let's transition him.
Mm-hmm.
It's so crazy.
Right. Access for $5 says boys are increasing false positives. A higher percentage of autogynephilias are transitioning now than they used to most historically. I don't believe that's accurate. I mean, if you have some numbers to show me that, every number I've shown or I've seen that shows an increase in number in young people, which shouldn't even be for AGP, even really specifically, has shown there's been a big increase in both males and females. It's just that the increase in females has been significantly higher because the rate was lower in females in the first place. So, Ryan O for $10 says, I feel like not caring isn't enough for far leftists. You have to be 100% supportive of the cause, otherwise you're bigger to them. Oh, I read that one.
Yeah, we're at
Naxos for $5 says AGP is found in 2 to 4% of all males. Most end up bisexual, but some transition. The percentage seeing transition as viable is increasing with attention.
right, because they're seeing it as an option.
Right. Well, I didn't know that the AGP numbers are that high, so it's interesting. But I guess the question is, and I've never seen twin studies on AGP to make the determination that if, what is
yeah.
like, how do identical twins versus fraternal twins with AGP, how's that manifest?
Aren't those twin
Exactly.
studies great?
Well, I mean, they're very useful for trying to make the determination about.
They are. They're like, let's
genetics,
check out your
epigenetics.
clone. Let's see what
Right.
your clone does.
Hold on, my thing's totally crashed.
Tommy Simonson for 50 DKKs says, yes, the once Trump pardon were guilty and served their time. A pardon gave them voting rights back. Way different than Hunter. How's that? What? Yes, the once Trump pardon were guilty and served.
He's saying that Trump.
time.
He's saying that Trump pardoned people who were guilty, and the pardon was just to get back voting rights.
Just so that they could have one vote.
I don't know if that's accurate.
Hmm.
I don't know 100%, but I would be surprised if every person that Trump, all those emergency pardons and everything, at the end of the thing, and for Jared Kushner's dad and for Steve Bannon and stuff, I don't know if that was they all served their time already. I don't believe Steve Bannon had gone to jail for that, but I'm not 100% sure.
That's interesting.
Alex Wright for $2 says, will Ron DeSantis replace Pete Hegseth? I had heard a rumor of that. I guess we'll find out. I mean, people would probably prefer that. Pete Hegseth has a lot of problems. I don't think he's going to make confirmation. He has a lot of weird accusations about, sexual impropriety, and more, probably even more devastating because there's more of them. He has all these accusations of being a drunk on the job, which you don't really want from your Secretary of Defense. So,
oh my God, can you imagine?
Yeah, so that combined with his lack of experience at doing that role, I think he probably won't survive. I mean, people prefer Ron DeSantis. It's still kind of weird, I guess, for DeSantis to be the Secretary of Defense, but is that like a normal thing for like a governor? I don't know if that's normal for a governor to be Secretary of Defense, but I'm sure people would appreciate it over Pete Hegseth. So
I'm down. It is. Can you even do any intoxicants when you're Secretary of Defense? It seems like you'd have to be, like, you'd sleep obviously, but you'd be able to wake up and be alert.
Well, I don't think there's like legally you can. I guess the question is, should you? Right?
Yeah, no, that's my
probably
question.
not.
Yeah,
that was the concern. Remember with the Biden's Secretary of Defense, where he had that surgery and he was out of it and like didn't tell anyone for a few days.
Oh yeah,
like, what the fuck? People are like really mad about
that. But I'm
that.
sure there's some kind of chain of command where somebody was able to step in. That's usually the way it happens. They don't need to say,
right?
Like, and why would you advertise? Oh yeah, our Secretary of Defense is incapacitated right now. Great time to attack.
Right. Well, you wouldn't advertise it to the world, but the problem was that he didn't advertise it to Biden or the government, so that they didn't, like, if there was a problem and they knew he's incapacitated, they'd know to immediately call the second chain of command as opposed to him. Right.
Biden didn't know? Oh, I guess
No,
Biden was already
Biden and Biden's
incapacitated,
administration did not know. I believe that was the case.
No, I can't imagine that. Somebody
It was
knew.
straight. I'm pretty sure this was the case.
Someone in the military knew. They had the chain of command in place.
Biden Biden's Secretary of Defense surgery? Because this was like a big controversy.
Naxalis for $5. Sitch, there is no true trans. You become trans because you develop a need. You are never born with the need. It's a sexuality that emerges with age.
I don't agree with that at all.
What is this?
If I were to accept that framing, then no one should transition because you can just teach them out of it. So
What
no,
is
I
this
don't agree with that at all.
How is it a sexuality?
Well, AGP is a sexuality or
Yeah, but
sexual fetishization or whatever you'd call it.
But there are
Aphilia, yeah.
But female to male transitioners don't have AGP.
Well, but that's right. But so Nax is trying to make the argument that I guess they're not real.
They don't
I guess
exist.
they don't exist,
Right.
which I don't think is true. And I just do not agree with this framing. I think there definitely are obviously people that have AGP, and from my research and understanding, there are definitely males or people that are born male who transition that do not have AGP but still have gender dysphoria. So,
Yeah, Buck Angel is the chief example that people give for the
well, that's woman
female
but
to
yes.
male.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's hard for me to like Buck Angel.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said Thursday he never told his own staff. Oh, he never told his staff to keep his cancer surgery and hospitalization secret from the White House, but acknowledged he should have handled it differently and apologized for keeping President Joe Biden and others in the dark for weeks.
Wow. Okay.
So there was some issue. Yeah.
They all knew. The staff knew. They're like, dude, Biden's brain dead. They ain't no one to tell. It's no one upstairs.
Right.
No one's minding the shop. We're running things now.
Right.
Brian, for $10.
Boys and girls are distinctly different from a medical perspective. This argument would suggest that there's no such thing as medication or treatment that can be specific based on biology. I mean, you're correct. I'm thinking like, because I don't know if it's ever come up legally before. That's kind of the issue.
Right.
Is like you have to argue things within these kind of legal bounds.
Right.
I don't know if there's ever been a situation that would arise that would test medicine in this very specific way or medical practices in a specific way. Where
Well, they are
like,
saying
where you're like have a medical treatment that would be prescribed to just men or just girls or just boys, but for some reason there's some change or the other gender / sex wants to get them all of a sudden, and there's this legal question. I don't think that's ever occurred before that I'm aware of.
Right.
So
it's like everyone should have access to breast augmentation, right?
right.
Fondue no, men can't do it.
No. Fondue Fried Hours has just caught up. It seems weird to me that a bunch of people who think sex doesn't matter are making this argument to the court. I mean, that's always been the inherent contradiction. I mean, I even made videos about this like a billion years ago, that all the trans stuff is an inherent contradiction to the entire worldview of gender that the left, or I should say the far left, has been pushing. So
yeah, that's a funny thing. It's like, we don't like gender stereotypes unless you're trans and you want to develop a stereotype of the opposite sex.
Right. Well, and just like to me, if you're making an argument that someone is born with gender dysphoria or the capacity for gender dysphoria, so if someone's born with some sort of innate feeling or desire or belief that they're like born as another sex, that can only exist if people have built within them some idea of what it means to be male or female already, intuitively or innately, I should say.
Right. Yes.
So.
But I don't know. We didn't listen to it. I listened to it before the show began, where Justice, I believe it was Sotomayor, was talking about just the tragic feeling people get, and everything she was saying, I think just that applies to like people who perceive themselves as ugly. Mm-hmm. Like if you're in high school or junior high and you're like, I'm ugly, nobody likes me, no one will ever like me, you have those same feelings of distress and depression. So I don't understand how they apply this to the transgenderism any differently.
Right.
Like, how is an ugly person not telling themselves, I was born in the wrong body?
Well, I don't know. I would think I mean, I guess if there was the right social environment, that could be the thought process, but I don't think that would be like the intuitive thought process would be, oh, I was born in the wrong body. I think the intuitive process would just be like, oh, I'm ugly. I wish I wasn't ugly. Like, I feel like it'd be a different experience.
Hmm. I think it's
Now, being a dead handsome, I can't, tell from experience, but I don't know.
right. Well, I think even if you're attractive, you desire to be more attractive. That's just human nature, right? Some
Right.
people desire to be the opposite sex. Everyone desires to be more attractive. Nobody
Yes.
says, "Look, I wish I was uglier." Nobody
Well,
does that.
some people do.
My God. Those people have a mental illness.
But it's not, well, I mean, I guess you can make the argument like people who are like trying to radically rebel against attraction or like normative
I think
attraction.
a lot of that rebellion is the fact that they're on the losing end of that attractiveness distribution.
So it's a cope, right?
Yes.
You could be right. You could be right.
Of course it is.
I mean, I don't know. Every once in a while, you see someone who you're like, wow, if they didn't like do all those things, they'd be pretty hot. But that's usually not the case. So, you could be onto something.
It's
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of overlooking. I think this is why Trump gets such buy-in when he talks about the Republican Party being the party of common sense, because I do
Right.
think there's a lot of just people understand.
Trans women have it and are in denial. Your brain scan idea will never exist. 80% of trans women are AGP. Well, I mean, I appreciate that. I didn't know that you had AGP. I know that Taft has AGP. I believe she said it when we talked to her.
Go down to the Buck Angel one. That's interesting. Nax
Well,
list for $5. Buck Angel has a AP.
autoandrophilia. It's the
Autoandrophilia.
female analog to AGP, but it's much more rare because inverted sexuality is highly male specific.
So Buck Angel is sexually aroused by the thought of himself as a man or herself as a man.
Well, I mean, listen, Max, if you want to send me this information you have, this data that you have, that's this idea that 80% of trans women have AGP and that there's no such real thing as gender dysphoria outside AGP, you can send it to me. This is completely at odds with all the research I've ever seen on any of this stuff. So, but feel free to send me something that shows otherwise.
It
Definitely
does
make
make
it
sense
easier
from a
to
sexuality perspective, though, because men obviously are the more eager sex.
Sure. I mean, it would definitely make it easier to discuss and regulate legally. So if that was the case, but let's talk about prepping for $2. Says, dang, France really told Korea, hold my beer. Oh no.
Now France is doing
France and martial law. What do you mean?
Doing the martial law thing? Please,
happened?
no.
What happened? State of emergency. Wait, no.
Oh, the real Holtzinator for $2 says, "Look, this is a fringe issue. Why are we covering it?" That's exactly what I was thinking.
That's the real
I was like,
thing, yeah.
nobody cares about this. Then why the fuck is it in the Supreme Court?
Right.
And people do every time I hear sex assigned at birth, it's like nails on a fucking chalkboard for me. It's so bizarre. We've got to look at this dark matter video because there's a lot of shit in here. Dark matter gets super upset about Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins being anti woke. And I just think, yeah, because they've fought so hard for an understanding of science and a social respect of evolution that this flies in the face of, that a lot of the transgender stuff completely flies in the face of. We're putting sex assigned at birth on legal documents. Of course scientists are going to be tearing their hair out. Of course atheists are going to be tearing their hair out. That's what woke is. It's anti-science. The real Holtzinator for $2 says, that's just because you're AMAB? What is that? Is that like ACAB? But
I don't know.
All
All men are
mamas are
bastards.
bastards. Oh, all men are bastards.
Let's see. Here's an article. French lawmakers vote to oust prime minister, plunging country into chaos. French Prime Minister Michael Barnier has been forced to resign just 3 months into his term after lawmakers on the left and right united to support a no confidence vote motion and plunge the country into deeper political instability.
You can't look
Okay,
just because I can recognize that men are the more eager sex. That doesn't mean all men are bastards. That's like, I mean, that's scientifically accurate.
all men are based.
All men. Oh, that's if it means all men are base, then yes.
Death by Slaughter says,
assigned male at birth.
Imagine members of a cult have infiltrated every major medical board in the country and take the dissenting board members hostage. The cult leaders then cry out that the medical boards agree with them. Wouldn't that be crazy? There you go. Saul for $2 says 15 years ago, there was a story of a Swedish couple who were raising their child genderless. Even when I was liberal and a TYT fan, that made me uncomfortable. It felt like they were making their child an experiment. They were.
Oh,
They totally were.
so scary.
Soto for $2 says A-Team has been subverting our democratic practices and therefore must all be spies for President Sunday. Taking a page from South Korea, we are now instituting martial law. No streams or chats allowed after bedtime now. There you go.
What's happened? What I'm doing? What? I'm subverting democracy?
Yes.
I'm the
you
one
are.
that puts up all the polls. What are you talking about?
There you go. Oh my God. There was
I
a poll
love
question.
democracy.
There was a poll question I need to ask everyone, and I totally forgot what it was.
What is it? We'll put it up now. No, we're ending the stream soon, so we
Sam
can't
said
do that.
something ridiculous, and I'm like, I have to ask chat.
Sam, what's it like that? Being able to throw a chat poll at your girlfriend like
It's
that.
pretty good.
That can't be good for the relationship.
It's pretty
man.
good. Well, listen, I haven't. So I haven't done the ultimate poll. So I have a jacket that I think is one color, and Sam thinks is another color, and I keep threatening to do to do a poll on it. Okay.
A jacket color?
A jacket. It's a jacket color. Okay.
Wow.
So we're gonna one day there's gonna be a jacket color. There's gonna be a jack off vote. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Chat's gonna decide a very important part of the relationship.
Do you have a picture of the jacket?
I don't, not yet. So
send me a picture of the jacket so I can weigh in before.
I want to take a picture and I want to do like the paint dropper test where you see what the color is in paint.
Oh yeah, okay, that's a good idea.
Right.
The RGB.
Right. Naxis for 2 hours says I DM'd you a link for data Sitch. Thank you. I'll check it out after the stream.
Right.
Okay. Anyway, thank you guys for coming. Thank you all for your incredibly generous donations. And we'll see you tomorrow where we're probably going to talk about maybe this a little bit more, maybe jank on Tim Pool, maybe the dark matter. We'll see you there.
Yeah. We'll do a recap on this and the other things too. Bye-bye.
Sammy G, democracy, the god that failed. It's pretty funny.